Key day 5, Tuesday, I think. The hinges on the storm door are wrong. I've been looking at them for 40 minutes, and they're just wrong. Whoever installed them put the pins facing up on the exterior side, which means any person with a flathead screwdriver and 30 seconds of patience could pop them out and walk right in. Doesn't matter that we threw 3 deadbolts on the door. Doesn't matter that Danny welded a crossbar to the frame last night. Those 2 little pins are the actual problem, and I've been staring at them so long I've started to wonder if I'm going insane. I'm not insane. The hinges are wrong. I'm going to fix them after I finish writing this. I started this notebook because Danny suggested it, and I told him that was a stupid idea, and then I couldn't sleep last night, and I started writing in it at 2 a.m., and now I can't stop. It helps. Writing things down makes them feel like problems with solutions, instead of just dread with no shape. So, from the beginning, since I've got nothing better to do while Danny finishes nailing the plywood backing onto the kitchen shutters. My name is Calvin Marsh. Cal. I'm 34 years old and I'm a locksmith. Have been since I was 22, when I apprenticed under a guy named Harold Fitch in the town of Pruitt Falls. Population, maybe 8,000 on a good census year. I own my own shop now, Marsh Key and Security. 11 years in business. Decent enough that I could hire my cousin Teddy 2 summers ago. Teddy handles the residential lockouts. I do the commercial jobs, the security assessments, the rekeys after tenant changes. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest, and the hours are decent, and you get to know a town pretty well when you're the person people call when they're locked out of everything they own. My brother Danny is 28. He does finish carpentry, cabinets, built-ins, trim work, that kind of thing. He's been at it since he dropped out of community college and figured out he could make better money using his hands than staring at a business administration textbook. He lives about 40 minutes from me in the city, has a good girlfriend named Nora, who was supposed to come visit last weekend but didn't, and that fact is sitting somewhere in the back of my head like a splinter I can't reach. Our grandfather, Earl Marsh, died 14 months ago. He was 81, and he had a good run, and the end wasn't painful, which is more than most people get. He left us the farmhouse. Left it equally to me and Danny, because our dad had been out of the picture since we were kids, and there was nobody else. The farmhouse sits on about 60 acres of mostly flat land outside a town called Hatterley, which is even smaller than Pruitt Falls, maybe 4,000 people, grain silos at the edge of town, a hardware store, 2 diners, a bar, and a post office that keeps threatening to close. Earl had farmed the land for 30 years, then leased most of the acreage to a neighboring operation after his knees gave out in the 90s. The farmhouse itself had been sitting empty for 2 years by the time he died. We've been meaning to fix it up ever since. That's what we were doing when this all started. Fixing it up. Danny had a job pause. The contractor he'd been subbing for lost a bid, and suddenly had nothing for him until late September. I'd been on a short schedule all month. Pruitt Falls is small, and there are only so many locks in a small town. We picked a week in early August and drove out separately, both of us pulling pickups loaded with tools, and the plan was to reframe a couple of doorways, fix the porch, replace the rotted sill plates under 2 windows, and get the gutters sorted before fall came. The farmhouse needed a lot more than that. It always does, when you finally look at something you've been ignoring for a year. The foundation was fine. The bones were fine. Earl had built solid, or rather he'd bought solid. The house dated to 1948 and had outlasted 3 generations of hard winters. But the windows had single-pane glass and frames that had swollen and warped. The front door lock was a 40-year-old knob lock that I could have picked with a paperclip in under a minute, which I told Danny, and he said I was being a locksmith about it, and I said that's what I am. The back porch had a section of decking that had rotted through entirely. The gutters were full of compacted leaf matter that had basically turned to soil, with actual weeds growing out of it. We started on a Monday. We drove out early. We stopped at a diner in Colebrook, the town between Hatterley and the highway, and we had eggs and coffee, and talked about the work list. Danny wanted to do the porch first because it annoyed him. I wanted to do the windows because the frames were the structural issue and everything else was cosmetic. We argued about it the way we always argue. which is that we both state our position once, and then one of us gives in and we move on. I gave in. We started on the porch. That first day was normal. The whole first day was just two brothers doing carpentry work on an old farmhouse, with country music on a Bluetooth speaker, and the smell of cut pressure-treated lumber, and a cooler of sandwiches and cold drinks from the diner. I replaced 3 knob locks with deadbolts, just because I had the hardware in my truck, and it bothered me to look at them. Danny laughed and said I was compulsively rekeying our dead grandfather's house, and I said somebody had to. The second day was when things started feeling wrong. I'm going to explain this slowly because I want to get it right. It wasn't dramatic. That's the thing. There was no moment where I looked at the sky and knew something was coming. It was more like, you know how sometimes you walk into a room and something is slightly off, and you can't name what it is, but the back of your neck knows before your brain does? It was like that for a full day and a half, before I could name anything specific. The first thing I noticed was the highway traffic. Route 9 runs about a mile east of the farmhouse, and you can hear the trucks at night if it's quiet. A low white noise that Earl told me he'd stopped noticing after his first month out there. I'd noticed it on Monday night, when I was trying to sleep on the inflatable camping mattress I'd brought. Normal. Semi-traffic, the occasional car. Tuesday night, I woke up at 3 in the morning and it was loud. Not a little louder, a lot louder. Steady, like rush hour traffic in the city, but on a 2-lane state route in the middle of the night in farm country. I lay there listening for a while. I told myself it was nothing. Some event? A detour? Whatever. I went back to sleep. Wednesday morning, Danny was already up when I came downstairs, and he had the portable radio on, a battery-powered unit he'd brought for the job site because he likes morning talk radio. He had it tuned to a station out of the city, which was about 2 hours south. The signal was weak, but clear enough. He said, without turning around from the coffee maker, "There's something happening." And I said, "What kind of something?" And he said, "Hospital kind." The radio host was talking in that particular voice. Radio people use when something is actually bad, but they don't want to cause panic. Measured, a little too calm, pausing, slightly too long between sentences. There had been incidents. He was calling them incidents. Multiple hospitals in the metro area reporting, quote, aggressive patients in states of extreme agitation. Police response ongoing. The city emergency management office had issued a statement. The statement said, to avoid downtown areas. Danny poured me a coffee and said, aggressive patients. And I said, yeah. And we stood there for a minute. I want to be honest here, because this is a notebook, and nobody's going to grade it. I didn't think zombies. That's not a thing a person thinks when they hear something on the radio. I thought riot. I thought some kind of drug situation, bath salts or something synthetic. We'd had a problem with that in Pruitt Falls 2 years back. I thought maybe a gas leak was causing mass hallucinations in one neighborhood. I thought a dozen mundane, explainable things before my brain even approached the category of things it had decided were fiction. What I did do, and this I'm proud of, in retrospect, was take the radio seriously instead of dismissing it. I said, let's go to the hardware store in Hatterley before we start today. Danny looked at me. He said, for what? I said, more hardware and food from the grocery. He knew what I was doing but didn't say it out loud, which is one of the things I like about my brother. We drove to Hatterley in my truck. Hatterley's hardware store is called Renner's, and it's been in the same family for 3 generations. And the guy behind the counter that morning was Pete Renner, who was about 60 and wore the same style of canvas vest every time I'd ever seen him. Earl used to buy all his supplies there. Pete recognized me from the few times I'd come out to visit Earl over the years. He said, "You're Earl's grandson." I said, "Yeah, Cal." He said, "Fixing up the old place?" I said, "Yeah. I need some hardware. Lag bolts, mostly. And I want to see what you've got in the way of door reinforcement. Hinge bolts, security plates, that kind of thing." He gave me a look that I couldn't read right then. Later I thought about that look a lot. He said, "Got some of that. Sold a fair bit this week, actually." I said, "This week?" He said, "Folks buying. You hear the radio?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know what's happening down south, but it makes me nervous. My cousin's wife works at Mercy General in the city, and I called her this morning and she didn't answer. Danny was overlooking at padlocks. I told Pete I'd take everything he had in security plates and door reinforcement hardware. He seemed relieved to sell it to me, like getting rid of it made him feel better." The grocery was 2 doors down, small, the kind of place that has 3 aisles and a cooler case that's always a little too warm. A woman named Bev ran it, Beverly Schott. She'd been there since Earl's time, mid-50s, and efficient in the way that people who run small-town stores get efficient. She had a teenager behind the counter named Kyle, who looked scared in a way teenagers usually don't look scared, just sort of generically anxious in a teenage way, not this particular pinched scared. I loaded up the cart with canned goods, beans, corn, tomatoes, soup, pasta, rice in 5-pound bags, sugar, salt, coffee. Danny came in with the hardware from Pete's and saw what I was doing and didn't say anything, just started helping. He found a shelf of bottled water in the back, not a lot, maybe 30 liters worth, and put it all in. I got 2 cases of batteries. Bev rang us up and the total was more than I expected and I didn't care. She looked at the cart and then at me and said, "You're stocking up." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I heard something on the news this morning. I've been buying stock when the delivery truck comes through, but I don't know when the next one is." I told her about Earl's place, that we were fixing it up and wanted to be prepared. She nodded like that made sense, and then said, kind of quietly, "My son didn't come home from work last night. He drives delivery. Route goes through the south part of the county." I said I was sorry. She nodded again and put our bags in the cart. We drove back to the farmhouse and started unloading, and while we were unloading, my phone started getting news alerts one after another, the little buzz 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 of 5 or 6 coming in at once. I looked at them and then put my phone in my pocket and said to Danny, "We should make a list." He said, "Yeah, we should." That was Wednesday afternoon. Let me skip forward a little and then I'll come back. By Thursday morning, I knew this was not a riot. I knew it was not bath salts. I knew because the radio had stopped being measured and calm, and had started being genuinely frightened in the way that's unmistakable, where the host starts saying things like, "We want to emphasize that we don't have confirmed information at this time," and what that actually means is that the information they have is too bad to say out loud. What they were describing, carefully and then less carefully as the morning went on, was people biting people, infected people, people who had been bitten, and who then, and the radio guy kept using the phrase, became agitated, but what he meant was something that didn't have a word yet. People who had been bitten getting sick very fast, and then getting up again and biting other people. The spread was out of the city. It was in 3 counties now. I'm going to say the word. Zombies. I know how that sounds. I know what it sounds like when you say it in the context of real life. But the thing about a word is that once the thing exists, the word is less stupid than pretending not to have the word. So zombies. That's what we were dealing with. People who were dead and moving and biting and passing it on. No other word fits better, and I'm not going to waste time being embarrassed about it. Danny said it first, actually. He said, "Cal, this sounds like a zombie thing." And I said, "I know." And he said, "That's not real." And I said, "I know that's not real. And I'm looking at this news app and reading accounts from people in the city, and it sounds like a zombie thing." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "What do we do?" And that's the question. That's always the question. Not what is this? Not why is this? Not this can't be real. Just what do we do? I have always liked my brother for getting to the practical question fast. What we did was make a list. The list, from that Thursday morning notebook I'm now transferring here. 1. Reinforce every entry point. 2. Assess all windows, which are weak, which can be shuttered or blocked. 3. Inventory all food and water. Establish rations. 4. Water source. The farmhouse has a well. Make sure it works. Make sure we can operate it manually if power goes out. 5. Power. The farmhouse has a propane generator. How much propane do we have? 6. Communication, the radio. What other options? 7. Weapons. What do we have? Earl's old .22 rifle in the front closet. Danny's pocket knife. My truck has a tire iron. 8. Escape routes. If the farmhouse is compromised, where do we go? 9. Figure out the perimeter. The property has a fence line. Is it useful? I looked at that list and then I looked at Danny and I said, this is either going to be the most embarrassing week of our lives or the week we stop being embarrassed about this forever. He said, either way, I'm going to need more coffee. Let me tell you about the farmhouse itself, because it matters. The main house is 2 stories, 4 bedrooms upstairs, living room and kitchen, and a small dining room downstairs. The kitchen has a back door that opens onto the old porch. The front door is center hall, faces the front lane which runs about 300 yards from the road to the house. There's a detached garage to the west of the house, a 2-car garage that Earl used mostly for storage in his later years, farm equipment and old furniture, and about 40 years of accumulated stuff. There's a barn further back on the property, maybe 200 yards north of the house, a proper old red barn that Earl had used for storage too in his later years, the cattle operation having ended in the 80s. The well is in the backyard, manual pump backup, electric primary. Earl had put the electric pump in maybe 15 years ago, but kept the hand pump because he was a practical man. The property has a fence, a proper post and rail perimeter fence on the east and west sides, and a 4-strand wire fence along the back. The front of the property, facing the road, has a gate, a proper driveway gate, iron pipe, maybe 8 feet wide, with a chain and padlock on it. Earl had installed it after some kids had been using his front lane to park at night. The gate is set between 2 stone pillars with old wagon wheel decorations welded to them, which Earl had thought looked nice, and Danny and I had always privately found hideous. The distance from the gate to the front door is about 300 yards. That distance mattered a lot later. There's also a storm cellar. I'll get to that. Day 1 of the real work, which I'm calling Thursday, even though I think of the first real day as starting at 2 a.m. Thursday, when I gave up on sleep and started writing a security plan on the back of a pizza box receipt. The front door first. That 40-year-old knob lock was already gone. I'd replaced it day 1 with a proper deadbolt from my truck, which I carry as a matter of course. What I hadn't done was address the door frame itself. Old farmhouse door frames are made of whatever wood the builder had handy, and they rot and shrink over decades. And what you end up with is a situation where you can have a perfectly good deadbolt installed in a frame that would split with 2 good kicks. I knew this because about 1/3 of my residential rekey jobs end with me telling homeowners that their deadbolt is fine, but their door frame is the problem, and they usually nod and don't do anything about it. I did something about it. I had steel security plates in the hardware from Pete's, plates that go over the strike area and attach with 3-inch screws that go all the way through the frame and into the framing stud behind it. I put those on both the front door and the back kitchen door. Then I added hinge bolts, little steel pins that project from the hinge side of the door into matching holes in the frame, so even if someone pops the hinge pins, the door stays in place. I added those to both doors as well. Danny, meanwhile, had gotten the generator running, about 60 gallons of propane in the tank, which he calculated was something like 8 to 10 days of regular use, but much longer if we were conservative. He'd found Earl's old toolbox in the garage, and was using the circular saw to cut plywood sheets he'd bought for the porch project into panels that could be fitted over the windows. We worked until dark without talking much. The radio was on in the kitchen. By Thursday evening, the radio was not being cautious anymore. By Thursday evening, there were 3 national emergency alerts on our phones, and the radio was looping official messages between regular programming, and the regular programming had stopped. The official messages said, shelter in place, avoid contact with anyone displaying aggressive behavior, do not approach persons who appear ill, emergency services are operating, but response times may be extended. Extended. That was the word they used. Extended. I ate a peanut butter sandwich standing at the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the front lane and the gate at the end of it, and thought about what extended meant. Here's something about being a locksmith that people don't think about. The job is about failure, not about success. About failure. Every day I go to work, I'm thinking about how things fail. Specifically, how locks and doors and security systems fail. I'm looking at a door, and I'm already picturing the 10 ways it gives way. I'm looking at a padlock, and I'm thinking about which of the 3 vulnerabilities in that particular model I'd use if I had to. I'm not doing this because I'm planning to break into things. I'm doing it because understanding failure is the only way to prevent it. This is a useful way to think when you're trying to fortify a farmhouse. I walked every door, every window. I noted every failure point. The kitchen back door was solid after the reinforcement, but it had a window in the upper half, one of those 12-pane doors that look charming and are a security nightmare. Glass breaks. Danny wasn't ready to hear we should remove the door entirely, so we compromised. We kept the door but built a plywood panel that could be slid down over the glass interior side and secured with wooden slide bolts. Not beautiful, functional. The windows. The farmhouse had 12 windows on the ground floor, and they were all single-pane, older frames, wood that had swollen in some cases and left gaps you could put a finger through. Danny built shutters, exterior plywood shutters on hinges that could be closed and bolted from inside, using a cord that ran through a small hole in the frame. Ugly as sin, those shutters. I drilled the hole and fitted a steel eye bolt at the interior end, so the cord had something to attach to. From outside, once the shutters were closed, the only visible opening was a half-inch hole that a finger couldn't fit through. By the end of Thursday, we had the ground floor windows on the west and north sides done. East and south windows would be Friday. Friday. I need to write about Friday separately, because Friday is when the first weird thing happened, and I'm still not sure what to make of it. Friday morning, I was in the garage looking for more cord. Earl's garage was a gold mine of useful junk. He'd kept everything. And I found a box in the back, pushed under an old workbench, that I hadn't seen before. It was a cardboard box, the kind from a big box store, sealed with electrical tape. On the top in Earl's handwriting, which I recognized from birthday cards and the deed transfer paperwork, it said, "For Cal and Danny, do not open until necessary." I stood there looking at it for a second. Earl had died 14 months ago. His lawyer had handled the estate, given us the farmhouse and the small savings account and the personal effects we'd wanted. Nobody had mentioned a box. I took it inside and put it on the kitchen table and looked at it. Danny came in from outside and saw it and said, "What's that?" I told him. He said, "Necessary like how?" I said, "I don't know yet." We looked at each other. I opened it. Inside, a Motorola 2-way radio, a proper long-range walkie-talkie, the kind that can reach 10 or 15 miles if conditions are right. A hand-crank emergency radio, with AM, FM, and weather bands. A sealed plastic container with paper documents inside. I'll get to what those were. A .38 revolver with a box of 50 rounds, and a letter. The letter was in Earl's handwriting, on lined paper, dated about 3 years back. I'm going to write out what it said because I think it matters. Cal, Danny, if you're reading this, you decided it was necessary. I'll trust that. I'm writing this in August, and I've been reading some things that make me uneasy, and at my age I've learned to pay attention to unease. I'm not going to explain what specifically, because by the time you read this, it'll either be obvious or it won't matter. The farmhouse is the right place to be if things go wrong. You know why without me saying it. It's defensible. It has water and land. It's far from the city, but close enough to get things you need. I built the storm cellar in 1987 when we thought there might actually be a nuclear exchange, and I never stopped being glad it was there. What you don't know about is what's in the cellar. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I'll explain in person when I can, but in case I can't, go look, and be careful with the radio. There are people I want you to contact if things get bad. There's a man named Ford Lassiter who runs the grain operation outside Hatterley, on County Road 14. He's been using my Northfield for 5 years now, and we got to know each other, and I trust him more than most people I've known. He'll know what to do. The frequency is on the radio. The revolver is clean. I got it legal in 1994, and I've maintained it. 50 rounds is what I had. I hope you don't need it. Love. Earl. We read it twice. Then Danny sat down in one of the kitchen chairs and stared at the table, and I sat in the other one. He said, Grandpa had a plan. I said, apparently. He said, for what though? For what specifically? I said, I don't know. Maybe he was 81, and he'd lived through a lot of things, and he wanted to have something in place. People do that. Danny said, you think he knew? And I said, knew what? And Danny said, about whatever this is. I didn't have an answer for that. I don't have one now. We went down to the storm cellar. The storm cellar is accessed from outside the back of the house, a set of wooden doors set at an angle in the ground, like you see in old farmhouses in the Midwest, designed specifically for getting underground fast when the sky turns green. Ours had a padlock on it. Earl's keys were on a hook in the kitchen, and I'd noticed the cellar key on the ring, but hadn't thought about it. We went down the concrete steps. Danny had a flashlight. I had the second flashlight we'd found in Earl's garage. The cellar was bigger than I expected. Earl had dug it out more than the original plans must have called for. It was maybe 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, with poured concrete walls and a ceiling that was about 6.5 feet high, enough that I could stand straight, but Danny, who has a couple inches on me, had to duck slightly at the center beam. There were wooden shelves along both walls, and those shelves were stocked. Canned food. A lot of canned food. Case after case of it. Organized by type. Beans, vegetables, fruit, soup, meat, powdered milk. Rice in sealed 5-gallon buckets. Sugar and salt in the same. Coffee in sealed containers. There was a water barrel. A proper blue 55-gallon barrel, the food-grade plastic kind, that was full. There was a second barrel next to it. There was a folding cot in one corner, a stack of blankets, a kerosene lantern, and several gallons of kerosene. A first aid kit in a hard plastic case that I opened and found to be actually well stocked. Not just a box of Band-Aids, but real supplies. Gauze and wound closure strips and antiseptic, and a blood pressure cuff, and a pair of prescription reading glasses I figured were Earl's. There was a small toolkit, redundant from what we'd found in the garage, but useful. There was a stack of books, mostly practical ones, some farming references, one on wilderness medicine, 2 paperback novels I recognized as westerns Earl had always liked. And in the back corner, behind a shelf unit that had been turned to face the wall, so you couldn't see what was on it without moving it, a second radio, larger than the Motorola from the box, mounted on a plywood board with a car battery wired to it. An antenna cable ran up through a conduit in the ceiling. There was a laminated card zip-tied to the board with frequencies written on it and small labels. One frequency was labeled Ford, another was labeled Weather, one was labeled GOV, Emergency, and had 2 frequencies on it. The last one just said Listen Only, with a note underneath that said Military. I looked at all of this for a long time. Danny said, he's been stocking this for years. I said, yeah. Danny said, why didn't he tell us? I said, maybe he thought it would make him sound crazy. Danny was quiet. He ran his hand along one of the shelves of canned goods, reading labels. He said, there's enough food down here for months, for a lot of people. I said, there's enough for 2 people for maybe 4 months, I'd estimate, or 4 people for 2 months. He said he thought about this. I said he thought about this. We stood in Earl's storm cellar for a while without saying anything else. Outside, faint, I could hear the sound of traffic on Route 9, still heavier than normal. And somewhere south, so faint I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, something that might have been sirens. Friday afternoon. We got the rest of the ground floor windows shuttered. Plywood panels screwed onto hinged frames that Danny had built, with the cord system I described. From outside, the farmhouse looked like it was braced for a hurricane, all those panels shut and bolted. From inside, it was dim and a little gloomy, but we had electric light from the generator, and it was fine. We also started on what I was calling the alarm system, which is maybe too fancy a word for what it actually was. Here's the logic. If something gets through the gate at the end of the front lane and starts coming toward the house, I want to know. Not when it reaches the porch. Earlier than that. So I took spools of wire from Earl's garage. He'd had a lot of wire, the kind of man who kept wire. And I ran it between the fence posts, along both sides of the front lane, about knee height, tied to the posts, and then connected at intervals to empty tin cans with a few pebbles inside. If something walked along the fence line or through the lane and hit the wire, the cans rattled. Not a perfect alarm, but a night alarm, something that might give us a few seconds of warning. I also hung a second set of cans from the porch railing, strung along a wire attached to the front door handle, so if the door moved, the cans moved. Same logic. Danny looked at the can system and said, "This is the most hillbilly security installation I've ever seen." I said, "Does it work?" He went outside and tested it by walking along the wire in the lane, and the cans rattled very clearly. He came back in and said, "Yeah." I said, "Then I don't care what it looks like." Friday evening, we tried the radio for the first time. The Motorola walkie-talkie from Earl's box first, just scanning. Got nothing intelligible. Some burst of what might have been someone transmitting on a standard channel, but too broken up to make out. The bigger radio in the cellar was more interesting. We went down and turned it on. The emergency government frequency was active. A recorded voice looping. "This is the emergency alert system. The following message is in effect for the following counties." And then a list. Hatterley was in Kessler County. I was counting as the list went. Kessler County was not on the list. The cities south of us were on the list. The 3 counties directly south of Kessler County were on the list. The message said, "Residents in affected areas are advised to shelter in place. Do not use roads unless evacuating as directed. National Guard resources are being deployed. If you require immediate assistance, contact," and then a number. The kind of number that, if you've been following the news for the past 2 days, you know is not going to answer. Danny said, "Kessler County's not on it." I said, "Yet." He said, "What does that mean? Does that mean they're not here yet? Or it means we're not important enough?" I said, "It means the problem started south of us, and it's moving. I don't know how fast." The weather radio had a forecast. Clear through the weekend. Warm. I wrote that down because it occurred to me that rain would make some of our outside work harder, and dry weather was a small advantage. The frequency labeled Ford. I picked up the handset and keyed it and said, "Ford, this is Calvin Marsh. Earl Marsh's grandson. If you're listening, please respond." Static. I said it again. More static. Danny said, "Maybe he's not on." I said, "Maybe," and I hung up the handset. We ate dinner in the cellar that night. Canned soup heated on a little camp stove I'd found in the back, and we talked about the plan. Not what was happening in the world. Not what the things on the road were. Just the plan. What we still needed to do. What we had. What we needed more of. I slept better that night than I had since Monday, which surprised me. I think it was the weight of the work. When your body is actually tired from having done useful things, it overrides the anxiety sometimes. Or maybe it was the cellar, the solid walls, the 2 feet of earth above us. Either way. Day 3 of the real work, Saturday. I had a conversation in my head during the night that I want to write down. It was about Nora, Danny's girlfriend. She was supposed to have driven up from the city last weekend, and she hadn't come. Danny hadn't said her name since we'd heard the first radio reports. I hadn't asked. I was waiting for him to bring it up, and he hadn't. I knew that was because he was managing it the way he manages things he can't fix, by not looking at them directly. I know my brother. When something is breaking him, he keeps moving, keeps working, keeps his hands busy, and the thing stays in a compartment somewhere behind his eyes, and he doesn't talk about it until he absolutely has to. I'd watched him do this when our dad left. I'd watched him do it when our mom got sick. So I wasn't going to push it. But I was thinking about it, and thinking about all the people we each knew who were somewhere in those counties to the south and not answering their phones. My phone. I should mention my phone. Saturday morning it still had signal, but the cell network was unreliable. Calls connected maybe 1 in 3 tries. and when they connected, the audio was bad. I called my shop. Nobody answered, but Teddy had called me sometime overnight and left a voicemail saying he was at home and okay, and his neighborhood was quiet so far, and he was going to stay there, and he'd try me again. The voicemail cut off mid-sentence, not like he hung up, but like the signal dropped. I called my friend Gary, who lived about 20 minutes from my shop. Gary and I had been friends since high school, gone different directions, stayed in touch in that low-maintenance way you manage with people from before your adult life. Gary answered. He said his street was fine, but there was smoke visible from downtown, and the power had flickered twice overnight, and he was staying inside. I told him where I was. He said, "Good, stay there." I said, "Are you okay?" He said he thought so. The connection got choppy, and then died. I tried 2 more numbers. One didn't connect at all. One rang and rang. Then I put my phone away and went outside to check the fence line. The fence. Earl's property had post and rail wood fencing on the east and west sides. Old fence, in decent shape because Earl had maintained it. 4 feet high, 3 horizontal rails between posts. It would stop a vehicle if the vehicle wasn't moving fast. It would not stop a person. It was decorative as much as functional, the kind of fence that marks property lines in the country and serves no real security purpose. The front gate was better, iron pipe, welded, with vertical bars spaced about 8 inches apart. A chain with a padlock I'd already looked at, a Master Lock 3, not a bad lock, about a 4 out of 10 for security, but perfectly adequate for what it had been designed to do, which was keep teenagers off the lane. Not what we needed it for now. I had a padlock in my truck. I always have padlocks in my truck. I keep several standard sizes and a couple of quality pieces for commercial jobs. I had a Medico biaxial that I'd bought for a job that fell through. Still in the packaging, never used. A Medico is a genuinely good lock. You can buy time with it, time being the thing that matters. I swapped it onto the gate chain. But the lock wasn't really the problem with the gate. The problem was that the gate was 8 feet wide, and the stone pillars on either side were 5 feet high, and neither the gate nor the pillars would have stopped a determined person from climbing over. So I spent Saturday morning running 4 strands of barbed wire along the top of the gate and across the tops of both pillars, extending the wire outward along the fence to either side for about 30 feet. Earl had a partial roll of barbed wire in the barn, not enough for the whole perimeter, but enough for the gate approach. The barbed wire was ugly. It would not stop anyone truly committed to getting over, but it would slow them down, and it would add noise. Wire vibrates, and anything climbing into it would make sound, especially at night. The thing about fortification is that you're not trying to build something impenetrable. Impenetrable is a movie idea. What you're actually doing is buying time and making the cost of entry high enough that whatever is out there finds an easier option. Zombies, I was coming to understand, were not problem solvers. They weren't going to see the barbed wire and get a ladder. They were going to find the path of least resistance, which is the same path of least resistance they found before they died. A door, a window, an opening. Barbed wire would stop them. Full stop. Problem-solving predatory humans were another question. That question would come up later. Saturday afternoon, I took the truck out for the first time in 3 days. This was a calculated thing. We needed fuel. The generator was running well, but I wanted more propane, and also I needed to see what was happening on the roads. Danny didn't want me to go alone. I didn't want both of us away from the house. We compromised. I'd go to Renner's Hardware and the gas station at the edge of Hatterley, no further, and I'd be back in an hour. I took the 38 Earl had left us. I felt stupid about it at first, and then I saw the road and stopped feeling stupid. Route 9, the state route that runs about a mile east of the property, was full of stopped vehicles, not moving slow vehicles, stopped vehicles. 2 lanes of road and maybe a quarter mile of vehicles just sitting there, some with their doors open, some with their engines still running if the gas hadn't given out. No people visible, at least not from where I turned onto the route. I sat at the intersection for about 10 seconds and then turned toward Hatterley instead of south, which was the correct decision. The road into Hatterley was clearer. I passed two vehicles that had gone off the road, one in a ditch on the right, one up against a fence post on the left, and I passed a house with all its lights on and the front door standing open, which I noted but didn't stop for, and I passed what looked like a dog lying in the road, not moving, and then I got to town. Hatterley looked like a snow day with better weather. The streets were quiet. Not chaotic quiet, but closed quiet, like a Sunday morning in a religious town. A few vehicles parked at the hardware store. The grocery was closed. A handwritten sign on the door that said, "Closed until further notice. Stay safe." The gas station at the corner of Main and Route 7 had someone standing in front of it. A man with his arms crossed, just standing there. I pulled in. His name was Garrett. Garrett Olney, mid-40s. The kind of guy who runs a gas station because he also does small engine repair in the bay, and the gas is just the front end of the business. I'd bought gas here Tuesday when I came through to the farm. He remembered my truck. He said, "You're staying at the Marsh place." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Smart. Better out there than in town right now." I asked what was happening. He told me what he knew, which was more than the radio. 2 nights ago there had been something on Route 9. He thought there'd been an accident. People had called it in, but the sheriff's office response had never come back. The following morning, a family from down the county had come through Hatterley, driving fast, and told him that the outbreak was at the county line. That was last night, roughly. He hadn't seen anything himself, but 3 other families from the area around Hatterley had filled up and left, heading north. I asked about propane. He had a small tank exchange, the standard grill-sized tanks, and I bought 4 of them, everything he had on the rack. Not enough for the generator, but enough to supplement. He said, "You got family out there?" I said, "My brother." He said, "Just you two?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I've been thinking about leaving. My sister's up in Orvale." Orvale was about 60 miles north. He said, "I don't know though. Leaving means being on the road." I said, "Can I give you the farmhouse radio frequency, if you need somewhere to go?" He looked at me for a second. Then he wrote down the frequency I gave him. I bought everything useful from the small station store: 4 cases of water, several bags of beef jerky and trail mix and protein bars, 2 flashlights, batteries, 2 cans of lighter fluid, 3 lighters, a first aid kit duplicate that had nothing in it I didn't already have, but which I bought anyway, a pack of disposable lighters, some zip ties. I drove back to the farmhouse. Danny was on the porch when I pulled up, and he looked relieved in a way he was trying not to show, that slightly too casual stance of someone who's been watching the lane. I said, "Route 9 is bad." He said, "How bad?" I said, "Stopped cars. 1/4 mile of them, visible from the intersection. No people." He processed that, said okay. I told him about Garrett. He nodded. We unloaded the truck. Saturday evening was the first time we heard anything outside the perimeter. We'd eaten, and I was doing a security check, something I'd started doing at dusk every evening, walking the perimeter of the yard, checking the fence line, checking the gate, and I stopped because there was a sound from beyond the gate, down the road toward town. It was a low sound, not a vehicle, not an animal exactly, though it was close to that, more like a large thing moving through brush, slowly, a sound without intention in it. I stood at the gate for about 3 minutes, and then I saw something. It was maybe 200 yards down the road, visible in the last of the daylight, moving in the ditch along the road edge, slowly. Upright, but wrong. The movement was wrong in a way that's hard to explain without sounding like I'm writing a horror movie. It was a person. I knew it was a person because of the shape. But the way it moved was like a person who had forgotten how to move, each step more deliberate than a step should be, the kind of purposeless momentum that has no idea where it's going. It wasn't heading toward the farmhouse. It was moving roughly south to north, along the road, paralleling the fence line, but not orienting to it. It disappeared into some brush beyond a curve in the road, and I didn't see it again. I went inside and closed the back door and told Danny. He said, "Was it?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Were there more?" I said, "Just the one visible. I couldn't see the road well in that direction." He said, "Do you think it saw you?" I said, "I don't think it was looking." This is the thing that I kept thinking about that night. It was not looking. It wasn't searching. It was just moving, which told me that they operated on something other than sight. They responded to sound, probably, or smell, or proximity. But they didn't scan the way a person does, didn't stand on a road and look left and look right. It was just in motion, like a thing that walks because walking is what legs do. That's a creepy thought to have at 9 p.m. in a mostly quiet farmhouse. Day 4, Sunday. We tried the Ford frequency again in the morning. The cellar radio, which was better than the walkie-talkie for longer range. I keyed it and said the same thing I'd said before. My name, Earl's name, asking him to respond. This time there was a response. A man's voice, older, with that flat Midwestern sound that tells you someone was raised on a farm. "This is Ford." "Who's asking?" I said who I was. A pause. He said, "Earl's grandsons." "Yeah, he mentioned you." I said, "What did he mention?" Ford said, "That you two were capable." His word. Said you'd know what to do if things went bad. I didn't know quite how to respond to that, so I said, "Things went bad." He said, "Yeah, I know. I can see your road from my place. Something came up it this morning. About 4 of them. They hit your gate, and they moved on down the fence line, and then came back to the gate again. They did that for about an hour, and then they wandered off." I said, "You can see our gate from the elevator?" He said, "Not the gate exactly, the pillars, the way the lane runs. I've got a good view from the top of the grain elevator, if you know what to look for." I said, "How are you doing out there?" He said, "I've got people. 11 people, including me. We're secure here. Been getting more secure every day. Earl told me about the cellar at your place. Said if his grandsons ever ended up there in trouble, I should talk to them." Danny was listening next to me. He nudged my arm. Ford said, "You got supplies? Food? Water?" I said, "Enough for now. We've got the cellar stores." He said, "That's good. Stay put. The road isn't good right now. That backed up traffic on Route 9 is drawing them. Whatever gets that much smell in one place draws them toward it. I've seen them pooling around the stopped cars." I said, "We're staying put. We've got some work to do still on the defenses." He said, "Good. Check in twice a day, morning and evening. This frequency. Keep it brief. I don't know who else is listening." I said, "Okay." He signed off. I sat in the cellar for a second and looked at the radio and thought about what he'd said. 4 of them. At the gate, this morning. An hour circling, then moving on. I thought about the gate lock. The Medico. A good lock on a gate those things could not open. Gate mattered. Gate had to stay locked. Sunday was alarm system work. I've mentioned the tin can wire along the front lane and attached to the front door. We expanded it. Danny had found a spool of fishing line in Earl's garage, the heavy stuff, 50-pound test, nearly invisible at ground level, and we ran it across the approach paths to the house from multiple directions. Not just the lane. Around the sides of the house, across the gap between the house and garage, across the backyard between the porch and the well housing. We attached different things to different lines. Tin cans for some, which were loud. For others, at the sides of the house where we wanted quieter alerts, we hung small bells, decorative bells from a box in Earl's attic, the kind you find in a grandmother's house. They made a gentler sound than the cans, but they carried further at night. I built a perimeter check into my daily routine. Dawn, walk the fence line outside, check the gate lock. Dusk, same, but also check all the wire connections. Midnight, quick interior check, all the shutter bolts, all the door locks. I set a watch alarm for midnight. Danny handled the 3 a.m. check. He was a night owl anyway, always had been, and he said it was better for him to just stay up until 3, rather than wake up for it. We traded off nights. The one not on check duty got uninterrupted sleep. The one on check duty slept in shifts around their 2 checks. We both ran on less sleep than we'd have liked, but enough that we could function. I found that 6 hours, even broken up, was enough to keep me sharp if I kept hydrated, and kept eating on schedule. Food schedule. We established this Sunday, 2 meals a day, not 3. Not because we were short yet, but because establishing a 2-meal rhythm when you're not hungry makes it easier to maintain when you might actually be short. Breakfast and dinner. Small snacks if needed midday. A handful of trail mix. A piece of jerky. We rationed the fresh food we'd brought first, then the canned stores from the cellar. Earl's cellar had something like 400 pounds of dry goods and maybe 600 individual cans or containers. For 2 people, that was a genuinely long time. Water. The well was working. We tested it carefully. The electric pump was running on generator power, and the output was clear and smelled right. We also tested the hand pump, which worked with some stiffness. We filled every container we had, the water barrels in the cellar, 8 2-liter bottles we'd found in the house, the cooler with ice we weren't worrying about anymore. I marked the levels on the large barrels with a pencil line so I could track usage. Sunday afternoon, a vehicle came up the lane. It announced itself before I saw it. The fishing line perimeter alarm at the far end of the lane, which I'd run across the entrance about 10 feet inside the gate, rattled its attached cans. I was in the house and I heard it, and grabbed the .38 and went to the upstairs front bedroom window, which gave the best view of the lane. A pickup truck, moving slowly, stopped at the gate. A man got out of the driver's side. He didn't look injured. He looked exhausted. I watched for a second. He was alone as far as I could tell. The truck bed was loaded with stuff, tarps over something, hard to tell what. He stood at the gate and looked at the house, and then he put his hands up, which told me he'd seen the window movement. I told Danny to stay in the house and I went out. I stopped about 30 feet from the gate. The man looked at me. He was maybe 50, heavy in the shoulders, working man's hands, a mustache that had grown past its maintenance date. He was wearing a quilted vest and jeans and work boots. He said, "I'm not sick. I swear to God, I'm not bit and I'm not turning." I said, "What do you need?" He said, "I'm trying to get to my daughter. She's in Orvale. I can't go through the county. The roads are completely blocked below 9. I thought maybe there's a way across the fields up here." I said, "Where are you coming from?" He said, "Colebrook. I was at my farm, my wife and I. He stopped. He looked down at the gate bar and then back up. "She got sick 2 days ago. I didn't understand at first what it was. And then yesterday, I understood, and I had to leave." He said he'd had to leave his wife. He said it with no expression, which told me it had broken something in him to say it. I said, "What's your name?" He said, "Lyle. Lyle Haddon." I said, "Lyle, I'm Cal. Do you have any injuries? Any bites or scratches you haven't told me about?" He pulled up his sleeves. He turned slowly around. He lifted the bottom of his shirt. He was not performing this, just doing it matter-of-factly, like a man who understands why the question is being asked. I said, "How much fuel do you have?" He said, "Almost half a tank. Enough to get to Orvale, probably." I said, "The back road through Earl Marsh's North Field connects to County Road 7, and that'll take you west away from the highway. From there, you can go north on State 11, which was clear as of yesterday." He said, "You'll let me through?" I said, "I'll unlock the gate. Drive through. I'll close it after you, and you take the lane around the back of the barn. The Northfield gate is on the north side, and it's padlocked, but I'll give you a key." I don't know why I helped him. Actually, I do know. He wasn't a threat, and he was a man who'd had to leave his wife behind, and he had a daughter somewhere north who didn't know yet that her mother was gone, and sometimes you just have to do the simple, decent thing. He drove through. I walked alongside the truck to the back Northfield gate, unlocked it with a key from Earl's ring that fit perfectly. He looked at me through the cab window. He said, "There's a woman in Colebrook, in the hardware store there. Her name's Bev." I said, "Bev shot." "From the grocery." He said, "She's in the hardware store, Renner's. She told me to find Earl Marsh's place if I came this way. She said if Earl's grandsons were there, they'd help." I said, "Is she okay?" He said, "She was okay yesterday morning. She's with Pete Renner and a couple others. They're locked in, but she said they were running out of drinking water. He drove off into the north field. I stood at the open gate, watching the truck get smaller in the distance. Pete's hardware store. Bev from the grocery. People I'd met 3 days ago for the first time and couldn't stop thinking about. I went back and told Danny. He said, "We should go get them." I said, "I know." He said, "Can we?" I said, "I don't know yet. Let me think." I thought about it for the rest of Sunday evening. The town was maybe 4 miles from the farmhouse. The route into town was the same one I'd taken Saturday, the road that bypassed the Route 9 backup. I'd seen one thing in the ditch at dusk Saturday, and then nothing else. But that was Saturday. This was Sunday, and the situation was not getting more stable. I also thought about Ford Lassiter's words. The pooling around the backed-up cars on Route 9. If there was a concentration of them near the stalled vehicles, and if the road into Hatterley ran parallel to Route 9, then the question was whether movement on that road, a running truck engine, would draw attention from Route 9 over to us. The answer was probably yes, at sufficient distance. The question was whether the sound of one truck at 4 miles would be audible over the ambient sounds already on Route 9. I didn't know. I checked in with Ford at the evening radio slot. I described the situation, the people in Renner's, my question about the route. Ford said, "The road between here and Hatterley has been pretty clear since this morning. They moved around the Route 9 backup last night, but most of them pooled toward town, not out here. I'd say go early, first light. Don't run the engine fast. Low and steady is less noise than high RPM, and go in and come out fast. Don't take long in there." I said, "How many people does Bev have with her?" He said, "No idea. But if they're in Renner's, they've got hardware, and they've got Pete Renner, who is a pretty sensible man." Danny had been listening. When I signed off, he said, "Tomorrow morning." I said, "Tomorrow morning. Before Monday morning, I need to tell you about the strange thing in the cellar. Sunday night I was down there alone, doing a late inventory count, and I noticed something I hadn't noticed in the initial inspection. One of the shelf units along the back wall, not the radio shelf, the other one, on the south wall, had been painted at some point. The wall behind it was a different color than the rest of the cellar. Not a big difference, just slightly whiter, newer, less old concrete yellow, and the shelf unit was not bolted to the wall. I moved it. Behind it was a door. Not a big one, maybe 5 feet tall and 2 feet wide, set into the concrete wall. A steel door, like a thick interior fire door, but scaled down, set in a steel frame that had been poured into the concrete. There was a lock on it, not a standard lock. A Medico like the one I'd put on the gate, original, which told me Earl had bought it from someone who knew locks and had it installed professionally. I sat in front of this door for a while. I thought about Earl's letter, which said the cellar, but hadn't said what specifically was in it. I thought about a lot of things. I didn't have a key for this lock. I looked on the key ring. Nothing fit. I looked through the box from the garage again. No Medico key. I could pick it. A Medico is a good lock, but it's not unpickable. I had my picks in my truck. But it was late, and I was tired, and the door wasn't going anywhere, and I decided to sleep on it. I told Danny the next morning, as we were getting ready to go into town. He looked at me and said, "What do you think is in there?" I said, "Something Earl wanted to secure." He said, "Good stuff or bad stuff?" I said, "The man stocked this cellar with 4 months of food and a .38 revolver and a military-grade radio. His idea of precaution is not like most people's. Probably good stuff." Danny said, "Or it's his doomsday stuff, and it'll make us feel worse." I said, "I'll pick it when we get back." Monday morning, first light. We went in my truck because it was slightly bigger than Danny's, and I'd already loaded it Sunday night while Danny slept. We took the .38, both flashlights, a crowbar from the garage, 2 empty 5-gallon water jugs, and the walkie-talkie. I also had my full set of locksmith picks in my jacket pocket, out of professional habit. The road into town was clear of moving things. There were 2 more abandoned vehicles than Saturday. I noted a minivan with its driver's door hanging open, parked half in the ditch, and a sedan that had rear-ended the minivan at some point and crumpled both their backs in. I slowed down to thread between them. No sign of anything moving in either vehicle, but I didn't stop to check. Hatterley at 6:15 in the morning in August, the light coming low across the flat land, the grain silos at the edge of town catching it first, that pale orange that morning does in late summer when the air is still full of humidity. A beautiful morning. The ugliest possible context for a beautiful morning. I'd called ahead on the walkie-talkie, found Pete Renner on the standard channel. It turned out he had a matching unit he'd taken from his store's inventory. He said they were upstairs in the store. He said the street out front had been active the night before, but was quieter now. He said I could pull into the alley behind the store off of Church Street. I did. I parked and Danny and I got out carefully, and I locked the truck out of habit. Genuinely, out of habit. I did it without thinking, and then felt slightly absurd, and we went to the back door of Renner's hardware store, which Pete opened from inside. 4 people. Pete, Bev, and 2 others I hadn't met. A woman named Helen, who was maybe 70, and wore slippers she'd apparently been wearing for 3 days, and a young man, barely 20, maybe, named Travis, who worked at the garage at the edge of town and had come into Renner's for a part when things had gotten bad and hadn't been able to leave. They looked rough, not panicked. They'd been through enough hours of it now that the panic had compressed into something else, a flat alert state that I recognized because I'd felt it myself. But they were tired and they were thirsty, and the upstairs room they'd been in smelled like people who'd been sleeping in their clothes for 4 days. Pete shook my hand. He said, "I remembered you buying all that door hardware." I said, "Paid off." He said, "You could see it? That something was coming?" I said, "I could see that something might be coming." He nodded, like that distinction made sense to him. Bev said, "How much water can you take?" I said, "We brought 2 5-gallon jugs. We can fill them from your tap." She said, "The water's been running, but I don't know for how much longer. The water here is municipal, from the tower at the edge of town, and without power I don't know when they pressurize." I said, "Fill the jugs and anything else you have. Fill everything." We spent 20 minutes doing that, everyone filling containers from the taps, quietly, with the kind of efficiency that comes from people who have been scared for 4 days and are very glad to have something practical to do. There was a moment while Danny was filling the jugs where we heard something outside, on the street, not the alley, the front of the store. A scraping sound, slow. We all stopped. Pete had the front of the store boarded up from inside, shelving units pushed against the windows. The scraping lasted about 30 seconds and then moved on. Nobody said anything while it was happening. When it stopped, Helen in her slippers exhaled a long breath. I said, "Is there anything in this store you're going to need and can't get later?" Pete said, "I've been thinking about that." We went through the store with a flashlight and loaded my truck bed with the most useful things: a coil of heavy-duty chain, 3 additional padlocks, a box of lag bolts, 2 boxes of wood screws, a hand drill with a full set of bits, 2 more spools of wire, a battery-powered work light, and 2 boxes of emergency candles. Pete also found a hand-crank water filtration pump in a camping section, still in the box, that he said a customer had special ordered and never picked up. We also took every battery the store had. The truck was full. Pete said, "Can we come back with you?" I looked at Danny. He looked at me. I said, "Everybody who wants to come. We have the cellar." There was a half-second pause, and then all 4 of them said yes, before the word was fully out. We couldn't all fit in the truck cab. Travis volunteered to ride in the bed, young and apparently not troubled by this, and Helen sat between Pete and Bev in the back seat, and Danny rode up front with me, and we drove out of town carefully, back through the abandoned vehicles on the road, back through the flat farmland, with the light now properly up, and the whole world looking almost normal, if you didn't look too carefully at certain things in the ditches. I pulled into the farmhouse lane and through the gate, and Danny jumped out and closed and locked the gate behind us, and then we were all standing in the yard, and the farmhouse was there, solid and shuttered, and for a second, nobody said anything. Helen said, "This is a good house." I said, "Our grandfather built it." She said, "He was a smart man." Day 5, back to where I started. With 4 more people, everything changed. Not in a bad way, in a complicated way. The farmhouse was big enough for 6 people to sleep without crowding. Barely. The food supplies became a real calculation, rather than a comfortable buffer. The water usage went up substantially. The security watch schedule needed to be redistributed. But also, more hands. Pete Renner knew construction. He'd built an addition on his own house 15 years ago, and he had genuine skills. Travis was strong, and 20 years old, and willing to do whatever needed doing. Bev had been running a small business for 2 decades, and immediately took over the food rationing in a way that was more systematic than anything Danny and I had worked out, and I was grateful enough to not feel territorial about it. Helen was 70, and she had bad knees, and she wore slippers the whole time. She also, it turned out, had been an amateur radio operator in the 90s, with a proper license. And when I showed her the cellar radio, she spent about 3 hours with it, and found 3 active frequencies I hadn't located, including one that sounded like it might be a military relay, very faint, and one that was definitely 2 people talking, somewhere to our north, in what sounded like a kitchen from the background noise, a man and a woman discussing whether they should wait or move. I got the hinges on the storm door fixed. That was Monday afternoon. I replaced the exposed hinge pins with proper security studs, non-removable, the kind that require the door to be closed to free the pin. Took 30 minutes once I had the right tools from my truck kit. The storm door was now as good as anything in a residential setting. The cellar needed more organization, with 6 people potentially using it. Danny and Pete spent Monday afternoon building additional shelf brackets and reorganizing the food stores, so everything was categorized and labeled with estimated quantities. Bev made a ledger, an actual handwritten ledger in a composition notebook she found in the attic, of every food item in the cellar, with quantity and caloric estimate. She said, "If we're careful, this is 4 months for 6 people, maybe more." I said, "We might have more people." She said, "I know. I'm making assumptions based on what I see." Travis fixed the barn door, which had been hanging crooked on a broken hinge for God knows how long. He also found, in the back of the barn, something nobody had mentioned: 2 bicycles, old 10-speeds, dusty but intact. He oiled the chains and tested them, and they worked. 2 bicycles were not vehicles, but they were silent transportation, and silent was worth a lot. Monday night on the radio with Ford. He said he'd seen more movement on the road between us and town. Not a flood, he said, not a horde. Maybe 30 to 40, scattered along the road, more concentrated near the Route 9 junction. He said the grain elevator had had a quiet day, and he'd gotten 3 more people. He said it the way you say it, just got 3 more, like they'd arrived for dinner, and was now at 14 people. I told him we had 6. He said that was good and solid. I asked him about the military. He was quiet for a second and then said, "I had a friend on the county emergency committee. He told me last week, when this was still in the early stages, that the National Guard had been activated, but they were told to hold at the county line to our south, not to enter Kessler County." I said, "Why?" He said, "My friend didn't know, or he wouldn't say. But Cal, there's something on the government frequency at around 2 a.m. I've been listening. It's very low signal, military encryption on some of it, but some of it comes through in the clear. The word they keep using for our area is buffer." Buffer. I sat with that word for a minute. I said, "As in a buffer zone." He said, "That's what I think." I said, "Between what?" He said, "I don't know. Between the spread and something to the north of us is my guess. But there's something else. You know the old Haskell facility, out on State Road 2, used to be an agricultural research station." I knew vaguely what he was talking about. A complex of low buildings about 8 miles southeast of Hatterley that had been an agricultural research station for the state university, which Earl had mentioned when I'd asked about it once. Said it had been decommissioned a few years back and sold to a private concern. I said, "Yeah, I know roughly where it is." Ford said, It's not agricultural research. Hasn't been for at least 3 years. I don't know what they've been doing there. But the trucks that go in and out are not the kind of trucks that go to a farm, and there's no fieldwork visible from the road. My friend on the emergency committee hinted that the quarantine of Kessler County might be related to whatever that facility was doing. He wouldn't say more. I said, "You think the outbreak started there?" He said, "I think it's possible. I think the military knows more than it's sharing. And I think the reason Kessler County is a buffer zone and not a rescue zone is because somebody somewhere has decided that cleaning this up matters less than containing it." I let that sink in. He said, "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to be straight with you, because Earl said you were capable, and I don't want to waste that. Whatever's happening, it started near us, and that might mean some of the answers are near us too." I signed off and went upstairs and sat on the bed in the room that had been Earl's, looking at the floor. Danny knocked and came in. He said, "I heard some of that." I said, "Yeah." He said, "What does buffer zone mean for us?" I said, "It means nobody's coming, nobody official." He said, "So it's just us?" I said, "Just us and Ford's group, and whoever else is holding on out here." He was quiet. Then he said, "Nora's in the city." And I didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would help. He said, "The city's in one of the affected counties that we heard on the radio on Wednesday." I said, "I know." He said, "She's probably—" I said, "Danny." He stopped. He looked at the wall. He said, "Okay." That was all. He went to his room. I sat for a while longer, and then I went downstairs and started writing this. Day 6, Tuesday. The door in the cellar. I went down before breakfast with my picks and my tension wrench, and I spent about 20 minutes on the Medico. Medicos are genuinely hard. They have a secondary pin system on the key that makes conventional picking much slower. You have to manipulate the pins in a specific order. I've picked a few over the years, practice models mostly, and one on an actual job where the customer had lost their key and been quoted a ridiculous price by the manufacturer for a replacement. It took me 15 minutes on that one. This one took 22, but it opened. The door swung inward. Cool air, slightly different from the cellar air, drier, with an electrical smell that I recognized as electronics on standby. I put the flashlight through the opening and stepped in. It was a small room, maybe 8 by 10 feet. It had been finished. Drywall on the concrete, a proper floor instead of concrete, a dropped ceiling with LED panel lights that came on when I found a switch by the door, running on whatever power source the main radio was connected to. In the center of the room was a table. On the table was a laptop computer in a hard case. Against the wall was a set of shelves with a dozen external hard drives, labeled in Earl's handwriting. There was a filing cabinet. There was a framed photograph on the wall, which I'll describe in a second. On the table next to the laptop was a single piece of paper. Instructions, in Earl's handwriting, for how to access the laptop. A password, his dog's name from 1987, apparently, which was Biscuit all caps. And a note. The note said, "The drives contain everything I've collected over the past 2 years. Reports, communications, photographs." I started digging because something about the sale of the Haskell facility didn't sit right with me. I'm an old man, and I don't know what to do with it, but I know it matters, and I know it should be somewhere safe. If you're reading this, and things have gone badly, the reason why is probably in those drives. The photograph. It showed the Haskell facility complex from what looked like a road photograph, a long lens shot, dated in the corner, about 2.5 years ago. And behind the buildings, in an open area that wouldn't have been visible at normal range, there were vehicles. Medical vehicles, the kind with the orange and blue stripe that you associate with biohazard and containment. 4 of them. And people in full hazmat suits, yellow, doing something in the open area that was unclear at that distance and resolution. I stood in that room for a while. I brought Danny down. Then I brought Pete down. Helen came on her own because she noticed us all going to the cellar and followed. We looked at the room together. Danny opened the laptop. It took a minute to boot, running on a UPS battery. The files were organized in folders, neatly labeled by date and type. Medical reports, satellite images, news articles, printed to PDF, communication intercepts. I didn't ask how Earl had gotten intercepts. The man had had a military-grade radio in his cellar, so apparently he was more capable than I'd credited. Pete picked up one of the hard drives and looked at the label and set it down. He said, "What are we supposed to do with this?" I said, "I don't know yet." Helen said, "Is this what started it? The facility?" I said, "Earl thought so. I think Ford Lassiter thinks so." She said, "So we're in the middle of it." I said, "We've always been in the middle of it. We just didn't know why." Danny was on the laptop, scrolling. He'd found the most recent folder, dated about 3 months before Earl's death. He said, "There are photographs here, from inside the facility." A pause. "I don't know how he got these." I said, "What do they show?" Danny said, "Animals. Lots of animals. In cages." He scrolled. "Some of them don't look right." He turned the laptop around. The photographs showed standard laboratory caging, the kind you see in biomedical research, rows of them. The animals were animals, rodents mostly, some larger, what looked like pigs in the background. But their behavior was wrong in a way the photographs suggested, rather than showed clearly. The ones that were still alive in the photos were grouped in corners, not moving in normal animal ways. The ones that were not alive were stacked in a corner in a way that made it clear they'd been bitten. I said, "This predates the human outbreak." Danny said, "By how long?" I looked at the folder date. "By about 3 months." Silence in that small room. Helen said, "Earl was watching this for a long time." I said, "Earl knew this was coming." And here's the thing I keep turning over. Earl had left us this farmhouse. He had stocked the cellar. He had set up the radio with Ford's frequency. He had put this room behind a door that I, specifically, could open if I needed to, because of what I do for a living. He had died before he could tell us in person, but he'd built us a starting position and left us the map. I don't know if that was foresight or coincidence or a very old man's very practical love. I put the laptop in its case and the drives in a bag and carried them up to the main house. They lived under the bed in Earl's room after that, which felt right. Day 7, Wednesday. First incident at the gate. I was doing the dawn perimeter check, alone, which I shouldn't have been, but Danny was still asleep and I'd let him have the extra hour. I came around the side of the house toward the front lane and I saw them at the gate. Not 30 or 40, not a trickle, maybe 15, grouped at the gate, which they'd apparently found in the dark and crowded against. They weren't pushing in an organized way. They weren't trying to climb it. They were against it the way water presses against a barrier, just there, pushed against by the ones behind them, and the gate was holding, but the chain was under some stress. I could see the medico jiggling with the collective weight against the bars. I backed up to the side of the house, out of their sight line. I went inside and woke Danny and told him quietly, and then woke Pete with the same low voice. The 3 of us went to the upstairs front bedroom window and looked down at the lane. 15, maybe a few more. The morning light was coming across the fields. Pete said, "What do we do?" I said, "Nothing. The gate holds. We do nothing." Danny said, "How long will they stay?" I said, "Ford said they circled for an hour Sunday and moved on. I don't know if that's consistent." We watched for a while. Helen came in and stood behind us without being asked and said nothing. Travis came in and looked and said, "That's a lot of them." I said, "Yeah." We watched. They moved at the gate, pressing and withdrawing and pressing again. Not systematically, just movement, the constant idle momentum they had. One of them made a sound, a low sound, that carried up through the window glass faintly. At about the 45-minute mark, something happened that I didn't expect. A car appeared on the road, coming from the south, moving fast. It came up the road toward the farmhouse lane at maybe 50 miles an hour, and then it braked hard and swerved around 1 or 2 of them that had wandered into the road and then it was stopped in front of our gate, and the cluster at the gate had turned, all of them, simultaneously, toward the car, and I had about 3 seconds to process this before the driver's door opened. I said, "No, no, no," and I was already running downstairs. I got to the front porch. The driver was out of the car, a woman, young, maybe early 20s, and she'd seen the cluster at the gate, and she'd frozen in a way that froze everything, frozen at the car door, and I yelled from the porch, not too loud, loud enough, "Get back in the car, right now." She looked at me. She got back in the car. She pulled the car forward onto the verge off the road, away from the gate. I went to the gate from the inside, walking steadily, not running, because running apparently matters. Sudden movement and sudden sound both matter. I'd noticed this in the week. I'd watched them at the gate long enough to know that low and steady didn't agitate them more than they already were. I took the crowbar from where I'd left it leaning inside the gate pillar. I'd started keeping it there for exactly this kind of situation, and I extended it through the bars, and I did something I'd been dreading. I pushed against the nearest one to break the pressure cluster. It moved backward. The movement rippled through the group slightly. They turned back from the car toward me. The woman in the car was about 20 feet back from the gate, watching. I said to the cluster, calmly, at a steady low volume, "Go away, go on." It sounds ridiculous, and it was ridiculous, and it did not work because of what I said. It worked because of the inconsistency of stimuli, I think. They turned toward my voice, which moved them slightly away from the gate, and the cluster's pressure on the gate reduced enough that I could see the chain relax. It took another 30 minutes before enough of them had drifted away that the gate approach was manageable. Then I unlocked the gate and waved the woman in, and she drove through, and I locked it again behind her and felt the chain's tension, and it was still solid. Her name was Amy. Amy Garrett. No relation to the gas station man, she clarified. It was just a coincidence of last name. 23 years old. She'd been driving north for 2 days from an apartment complex on the south end of the county. She had a backpack, a half tank of gas, and a gash on her left forearm that she said was from broken glass when she'd gone through a window in a building she'd gotten trapped in, not from a bite. I'd heard that line before in the first minutes I'd known her. I've heard everyone say it when they show up. Not from a bite. It's always the first thing. The forearm wound was not from a bite. I looked at it carefully, and it was a clean glass wound, about 3 inches long, already scabbing on one end, and open, and slightly infected on the other. Bev cleaned it out with antiseptic from the first aid kit, while Amy sat at the kitchen table and held very still. Amy said, "I didn't know where else to go." Danny gave her coffee from the morning pot. She held the mug with both hands. She said, "There are a lot of them on the road south of here. A lot. It's not like a few. It's like they just keep coming." I said, "Where were you headed?" She said, "I heard a radio broadcast. Someone was broadcasting on a local frequency, AM, saying there was a shelter at the grain elevator on County 14. I was trying to find County 14. I said, "That's Ford Lassiter's place. It's about 2 miles from here." Her face did something. Relief. And then the particular kind of relief that makes you cry if you're 23 and you've been alone in a car for 2 days. She managed not to cry. She looked at the coffee mug. "I got Ford on the radio. I told him Amy was here and she'd been trying to reach them. He said to let her rest a day, and then send her over when the road looked clear. He said the road between our places was clear as of that morning. 2 miles of open country road with good sight lines. Amy stayed for 3 days. Not 1, because the arm got worse before it got better. And Bev and Helen made a joint decision that she wasn't moving until the infection was down. I won't argue with 2 women who've decided something sensible between them. Day 8, Thursday. Let me tell you about what we'd built by this point. The farmhouse now had every ground floor window shuttered with plywood panels on external hinges, cordable from inside. Every door reinforced with security plates, hinge bolts, and double deadbolts. I'd pulled the hardware from my truck and Danny had added additional wooden crossbars we could drop in brackets he'd built. The front door, back door, and cellar storm doors were all as solid as I could make them with what I had. The alarm system covered the lane, both sides of the house approach, the backyard, and the gap between the house and garage. Approximately 300 feet of wire, with various noisemakers attached. The system had saved us twice from minor surprises. Once when a single one wandered into the backyard from the east field, triggering the backyard alarm at about 11 at night. And once when something moved along the west fence line and I heard the bells before I heard or saw anything else. The well was operational and protected. I'd built a cover for the hand pump mechanism, a simple wooden box that could be locked, so nobody could tamper with it from outside. The electrical pump had been running fine, but I'd developed a habit of turning it off overnight and using the hand pump for morning water to reduce generator noise during the quietest and most sensitive hours. The generator. I'd set it up in the garage with the exhaust vented through a hole Danny cut in the garage wall, keeping the running noise somewhat muffled. It still made noise. We minimized runtime, 2 to 3 hours in the morning for appliances, and then again briefly in the evening. The rest of the time we used candles and the battery-powered work light from Pete's store, which was rechargeable and had been doing well on the single daily charge cycle. We had 6 people, and now Amy made 7. 7 people on a rotating watch schedule, 2 meals a day, rationed water, specific jobs for each person. My job was security, locks, alarms, perimeter checks, gate maintenance, overall assessment of vulnerabilities, also radio contact with Ford twice daily, also being the person who made decisions about who came through the gate, which I'd sort of assumed by default and no one had argued with. Danny's job was construction. He and Pete worked every day on improving the fortifications, adding layers, addressing whatever I identified as a weak point. They'd built proper wooden shutters to replace our early plywood approximations on 4 windows. They'd reinforced the second-floor stair entry with a gate across the top that could be padlocked. This was my idea, the concept being that if the ground floor were ever compromised, the stairway gate bought time. Danny had built it in half a day from materials in the barn. Bev ran the food. Helen ran the radio in my absence and kept notes on every frequency scan and every contact. Travis was physical labor and watch. He had the longest night shifts of any of us, partly because he was 20 and partly because he volunteered for them, and we weren't going to argue. Pete did construction and also served as a second person on gate decisions when I wasn't available. Amy, once her arm was better, ran the bicycle reconnaissance. This was not a thing I'd planned, but it became a thing. She'd take one of Earl's bikes about a mile out from the property along the secondary roads, moving quietly, and just observe what was on the roads, where concentrations were. She'd come back and report. She had sharp eyes and an oddly calm manner under pressure that I found impressive in a person who had 2 days earlier been almost paralyzed at the gate. She told us once, on one of her bike runs, she'd found something strange along the county road east of us. She said there was a length of road, maybe half a mile, where everything was wrong in a specific way. Dead animals along the road shoulder. Not random roadkill, but many of them, clustered, and they died not from impact or bites but from something else. She said some of them were rats and rabbits and a couple of possums, and their bodies were in an advanced state, but the way they were positioned made her think they'd died in place, right where they fell, without moving. She said, it was like they all just lay down. I said, which direction was that road? Roughly. She said, southeast, toward the old research buildings on State Road 2. I wrote that down. Day 9, Friday. 2 things on Friday. The first, I picked a man at the gate in the afternoon. Another arrival, alone, in a beat-up work truck, and this one had come from the northeast, from the direction of Orvale, which was supposed to be clear. His name was Greg Holt, mid-30s, said he'd been a county road crew foreman and had been driving since early morning. He showed his arms and back and said he hadn't been bitten. I believed the not bitten part because I could see it, and his story was consistent. What made me nervous was that he had come from the northeast, which should have been cleaner, and he said Orvale was not clean anymore. He said Orvale had had its own outbreak, smaller but real, starting about 3 days after ours did. He said the roads between here and Orvale were manageable but not good. If Orvale was affected, our clean evacuation route north was gone. I told him to wait, and I went inside and radioed Ford. Ford said he'd had the same information from one of his recent arrivals, that Orvale was compromised, that it appeared the outbreak was spreading in multiple directions and not contained to the South County. I let Greg in, and he was a useful addition. He knew every county road in Kessler County from 12 years of maintaining them, and he sat down that evening with Amy and drew a detailed map from memory of which roads went where and which had bridges that could or couldn't handle heavy vehicles. The second thing on Friday was worse. Helen found a frequency on the cellar radio, late evening, that was broadcasting clearly. Not a relay, not a recording, a live human voice. A man, older, with a smooth radio voice that had gone rough at the edges from what sounded like a lot of hard days. He was broadcasting on an AM frequency, and he was talking about Kessler County. He said the following, and Helen wrote it down. If you are in Kessler County, you need to understand that you are inside a designated research perimeter. The Haskell Biological Sciences Center on State Road 2 in Kessler County was the origin point of a controlled trial that escaped containment approximately 14 days ago. The military presence you may have expected has been redirected to the perimeter, not the interior. The reason for this is that the Haskell facility was conducting trials on a modified pathogen as part of a federal emergency preparedness program, and the CDC containment protocol for an escaped modified pathogen requires a hard perimeter, not internal response. They are not coming to get you. They cannot come. The best your government can do for you right now is make sure this does not spread further north. That's the honest situation, and I'm saying it because someone should say it honestly. He continued. He said there were survivor communities in the county, including one at the grain elevator on County Road 14. He mentioned it by name. He said, if you can reach that location safely, it is currently the most defensible civilian position in the county. If you cannot reach it, find the highest ground and the oldest building you can. Old buildings were built to last. New buildings were not. Fortify what you have. Then he gave a name, not his name, but a name, Haskell, and an address, and he said, evidence of what happened here is at that location, and someone should preserve it. I am at, and then the signal cut out. We never heard from him again on that frequency. Helen looked at me across the cellar. She said, research perimeter. I said, yeah. She said, Earl knew. I said, Earl suspected. Now we know. I thought about the drives in the hard case under Earl's bed. 3 months of documentation. Photographs of hazmat suits. Animals in cages. I thought about the word buffer. I thought about Ford Lassiter saying the military was holding at the county line, not entering. And I thought, whoever that man was on the radio, he was right. Nobody official was coming into Kessler County. Because if you send people in, the people can come out. And whatever they've been exposed to comes with them. The math of containment doesn't care about individuals. We were in a test subject county. I didn't sleep Friday night. I did a lot of writing instead. I filled half this notebook with things I wanted to get down in case something happened to me. Information that seemed important to have recorded. Earl's drives. The frequency the radio man had been broadcasting on, in case someone could find it again. Ford's frequency. The layout of the farmhouse and the cellar, and every entry point and how it was secured. Bev's food ledger system. The map Greg had drawn. I also thought, for the first time concretely, about leaving. The farmhouse was good. It was genuinely good. We'd built it into something I was proud of, in a professional way. A locksmith's assessment of a security position. But it wasn't forever. Nothing is forever. The food was finite, and getting more finite as our numbers grew. The water was fine for now, but dependent on the well, which was dependent on the aquifer, which was dependent on things we didn't control. The perimeter alarm was effective, but reliant on the integrity of the fence, and the fence was 4 feet of wood rail that a strong push in the right place would compromise. And more than anything, the situation wasn't stable, wasn't improving, and had no visible resolution as long as we stayed inside a military buffer zone. Ford's grain elevator. 14 people as of our last contact. Now probably more. A concrete structure, built to hold grain under pressure, which means it was built to hold almost anything. Multiple stories. Good sightlines. A working radio that Ford had on a dedicated power system. And Ford himself, who Earl had trusted. The grain elevator was 2 miles away. 2 miles of county road, which Amy said was manageable in the daytime with good visibility, but which had more of them on it than it had a week ago. I thought about Earl's note. The letter in the box. He'd said Ford would know what to do. Day 10, Saturday. I need to write about Greg's map more carefully, because it becomes important. After Greg had drawn it out, I'd transferred it to cleaner paper. I'm a fair hand at this. I've drawn floor plans for security assessments enough times to have steady lines. The county road system in this part of Kessler County was not complicated. It was a grid, mostly. The kind of grid that Midwestern agricultural land settles into, because it makes sense for farming. County Road 14 ran north-south, with the grain elevator visible from Route 9 intersection. Our farmhouse was on an unnamed farm road that connected to Route 7, which ran east-west and intersected with County Road 14, about a mile south of the elevator. Direct route, 3 miles total, half on the farm road, half on Route 7, a quarter mile on County Road 14. This was the obvious route and probably the most dangerous. It brought you close to the Route 9 junction, which Ford had said was the densest concentration. Alternative route, up the Northfield Access Road, which connected to a field road through the adjacent property, Lassiter's North leasing acreage, Ford's own land, running northeast and then cutting east along a tree line, directly to the elevator's west loading dock. This was about 3.5 miles but used no public road, and the field road had good natural cover, a hedgerow along the south side of the property that would screen a vehicle from Route 9. I showed the map to Danny and then to Ford on the radio. Ford said the alternative route was what he'd been thinking. He said the field road was rough and soft. It hadn't been graded since spring, and recent dry weather would have hardened it, but not perfectly. A heavy vehicle would get soft spots. 2 vehicles following each other at a moderate distance, rather than one convoy, so if the first got stuck, the second wasn't trapped behind it. We had 3 vehicles, my truck, Danny's truck, and Greg's work truck. 3 vehicles for 7 people, plus whatever we could carry, well within capacity. I said to Ford, "What's the timing look like?" He said, "Things have been quieter the past 2 days. I don't know if that's a pattern or a lull. If I were going to move, I'd move at first light on a clear day, when visibility is good, and before any movement has been agitated by the morning heating." I said, "A day or 2. He said, "A day or 2. Saturday afternoon, while I was planning the move, and Danny and Pete were doing final fortification tasks, and Amy was on a bike run, and everyone was doing what they were doing, Bev came and found me. She sat down at the kitchen table and she looked at me and she said, 'Can I tell you something that I haven't told anyone else?' I said yes. She said, 'The young man Lyle Haddon who came through here. He told me he was going to Orvale.' I said, 'His daughter.' She said, 'He didn't make it.' I looked at her. She said, 'I had his CB radio channel from before he left. He had a CB in the truck, and he gave me the channel, because I had a CB here in the store. He called me from the road Wednesday. He'd made it partway to Orvale, County Road 11, and he'd hit a cluster of them on the road. A large group, he said, and his truck had gone into a ditch. He was calling from the truck.' She said, 'He was calling from the truck, and he said the truck wouldn't go, and there were too many outside the windows. He said he was going to wait them out, and he called me at intervals for about 2 hours, and then he stopped calling.' I said, 'Bev.' She said, I know. I needed to tell someone, because I've been carrying it since Wednesday, and it's heavy.' I said he left his wife and was trying to reach his daughter. He was doing what he had to do. She said, 'I know that. That doesn't make it lighter, but I know that.' She got up and went back to the kitchen and made something with the camp stove, and that was that. The things people carry around for days without saying anything, they get heavy for everyone eventually. Sunday. Day 11. Helen found something on the radio that morning that changed the plan. She'd been up early doing a scan. She sometimes did this before anyone else woke up, the retired radio operator habit. And she caught a very brief signal, low frequency, directional, from the northwest. Not the broadcast man, not Ford. Someone else, transmitting on a non-standard frequency in the middle of the morning. She decoded it, not decoded like a cipher. She meant she tuned and adjusted until it was clear enough to understand, which took her about 20 minutes. What she heard was two voices, clearly military based on their phrasing and brevity, talking about a route. They mentioned State Road 2. They mentioned the Haskell facility. They mentioned a timeline of 48 hours. She came and found me as I was making coffee. She said, "Something military is coming. Not here. To the facility. In 48 hours. I sat down, said, "What kind of something?" She said, "Cleanup, I think." They used the word remediation, which in environmental terms means you're removing something that shouldn't be there. And they used the word materials. I said, "They're cleaning up the facility." She said, "My interpretation. If someone left documentation behind at the facility, like the broadcast man suggested, and the military is doing a remediation run in 48 hours, those materials are gone. Earl's drives will be the only record." I stared at my coffee. Danny came downstairs. I told him. He listened, and then he looked at the ceiling for a second, and then he looked at me and said, "We go to Ford's today." I said, "Yeah, today. The last morning at the farmhouse. We had 4 hours to load the trucks and go." I made everyone prioritize, the cellar food stores as much as 3 trucks could carry, the hard case with Earl's laptop and the drives, the first aid kit, every useful tool that could fit, the radio from the cellar on its board, and the people. Everything else was secondary. Danny and Pete stripped the cellar in about 2 hours while I did final security checks. I wasn't securing it for our return. I was securing it in the way you secure something when you won't be there, because an unsecured farmhouse would draw attention, and I didn't know who else might find it and what they might do with it. So I shut the storm cellar doors and locked them. I closed and locked every window shutter. I locked every door. I hid a key to the front door under a specific flagstone on the porch that I wrote down in this notebook, because you don't know what you'll need to come back to. The gate I left locked. Whatever came to it after we were gone would find a locked gate. I stood in the kitchen for a minute before I left. The kitchen where we'd eaten sandwiches and listened to the radio in those first bewildering days. Where Bev had cleaned Amy's arm. Where Helen had made notes in her careful retired radio operator hand. Where Danny and I had made a list on a Thursday morning. Just a practical list. Because that's what you do when you have no idea what else to do. The kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke from the camp stove. And something underneath both of those that was just the house itself. Old wood and old plaster, and the particular smell of a building that has been occupied and loved for a very long time. I said, inside my head, to Earl, "We did okay, I think. Your cellar held us. I found your door." Then I went outside and got in my truck. The drive to Ford's. 2 miles on the field road. Not bad except for one soft spot about halfway that Danny's truck almost got stuck in. He powered through with the 4-wheel drive engaged and came out the other side, trailing a rooster tail of dark soil. Greg's work truck came through after him with no problem, the heavier rear axle giving it enough traction. The hedgerow along the south property line was dense enough in the August growth that we couldn't see Route 9 from the road. We could hear it. Or rather, we could hear sounds from it. The sounds that have no single source but accumulate. And I drove with my window down despite the exhaust from the truck ahead of me, listening. And what I heard was a lot, and I was glad we weren't on that road. The grain elevator came into view from the northwest approach, and it looked exactly like what it was. A concrete cylinder about 90 feet tall, with a cluster of lower outbuildings around it. And above the loading dock on the west face, there were 2 people visible on a catwalk, watching us come. The loading dock gate was open. A man was standing in it. 60s, built like someone who had spent 40 years doing physical work, wearing a feed cap and a work shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. He had a shotgun in the crook of his arm, and he looked at each truck as it came in, and then he nodded. I rolled down the window. He looked at me and said, "Calvin Marsh." I said, "Ford Lassiter." He said, "Your grandfather was a good man." I said, "Yeah, he was." He stepped back and waved us through. 2 weeks at the grain elevator. I'm going to compress this section somewhat, not because nothing happened, but because this notebook is already very full, and some of what happened was daily maintenance and survival, and the grain elevator itself is a different story that maybe deserves its own account. Here's the short version of the structure. The elevator itself, the main concrete cylinder, was inaccessible to the infected and appeared to be of no interest to them. A smooth concrete cylinder 90 feet tall has no entry point at ground level except the door on the south face, which Ford had secured with a bar and chain, similar to what we'd done at the farmhouse gate. The outbuildings were lower and more vulnerable, so Ford's group had been fortifying them steadily. By the time we arrived, they had the loading dock, the office building, and the grain processing shed all connected and secured, with the approach from the south blocked by a steel panel vehicle barricade that 2 of Ford's people had assembled over a week from salvaged metal. 22 people total, with our 7 arriving. Enough food to extend well given what we'd brought from the cellar. Water from a large rain cistern Ford had on the property, plus a secondary well. Better generator situation than the farmhouse. Ford had a proper 12-kilowatt diesel unit, with 300 gallons of diesel in a farm tank. I'm going to tell you the things that mattered in those 2 weeks. Ford Lassiter turned out to be exactly what Earl had said, capable and trustworthy in a plain and consistent way. He ran his survivor group the way he apparently ran his grain operation, methodically, without drama, with a genuine preference for collective decisions over individual authority. He had a woman named Jo, who was his de facto second, a county extension agent in her 40s, who knew more about agriculture and field medicine than anyone else we had, and she and Bev together reconfigured the food system into something genuinely sustainable, not just rationing, but planning. Ford had also been documenting the outbreak. He'd kept a radio log and a handwritten journal of what he'd observed from the elevator catwalk: dates, directions of movement, concentrations, behavior patterns. His log and Earl's drives together were starting to feel like a record that mattered: the behavior of the infected. I want to write about this because I've spent 12 days watching them, and some patterns are clear now. They don't plan. I want to be very clear about this, because it matters for survival. They are not strategic. They do not coordinate. They do not figure things out. They respond to 2 things primarily: sound and movement, and to a lesser degree, smell. A loud sound brings them toward it. A moving thing brings them toward it if the movement is within a certain range. They don't see well, I think. Or rather, they see, but they process what they see slowly, or not at all. They don't recognize shapes the way a living person does. They walk. They don't run. I haven't seen a single one run. This is important. This means that on foot, you can outpace them. On a bicycle, you can outpace them easily. You have to be careful about the cluster situations. When a group of them is pressed together, they can surround and trap. And being surrounded is what kills people, not any individual one of them being fast. They're slow. In a cluster, they're dangerous, because you're then outnumbered and surrounded, not because they're capable of anything complex. They bite when they contact something living, by apparent reflex. I've watched this from the catwalk at the elevator. One of them walking near the perimeter, something small moving in the grass, the infected thing orienting, and then the motion of biting. It's not predatory in any cognitive sense. It's reflex, a stimulus response, with no brain between stimulus and response. What this means for us: noise discipline, movement discipline, and never get cornered. 3 rules that cover most of what keeps you alive. They don't climb. They don't open doors or windows or gates. They don't look up. They don't cooperate. They walk until something stimulates them. Then they converge on the stimulus, and when the stimulus is gone, they disperse slowly, in whatever direction they'd been going. They are not a thinking enemy. They are a physical obstacle with one dangerous behavior. Don't let them touch you, and you're fine. The transmission. I've watched it twice, from a safe vantage. A bite, then nothing visible for some hours. Then the person begins to move wrong, like a ship list that keeps increasing. And then they stop moving coherently. And then, within about 8 hours of the bite in both cases I watched, they were back up and walking, and were part of the obstacle, instead of the person navigating it. 8 hours is a long time if you're watching someone you love. It's also enough time to make decisions that need to be made. The night of the 18th day since we'd arrived at the farmhouse, I've lost track of the calendar date. I just count from when things started. Something happened that I want to write down exactly as I remember it. Greg Holt came off a late watch at the elevator catwalk and came to find me. He said, "There's light to the southeast." We went up to the catwalk. The night was clear, late August, full of stars, in the way that only gets fully visible when there's no light pollution for miles. And to the southeast, maybe 8 miles, there was an orange glow. Not steady. It pulsed slightly, the way fire pulses, but it was too large and too distant to be a structure fire. Something larger. Greg said, "That's roughly where the Haskell facility is." I said, "Yeah." He said, "You think the military lit it?" I said, "I think they remediated it." "Yeah?" We watched for a while. The glow lasted about 2 hours and then faded. Whatever was there was gone. I thought about the broadcast man, whoever he'd been, broadcasting from somewhere near the facility, saying someone should preserve the evidence. His signal had cut out mid-sentence. The timing of his silence and the glow on the horizon aligned in a way I wasn't going to say out loud. I thought about Earl's drives. Sitting in the hard case inside the elevator office, backed up now to 3 separate drives after Helen and I had spent an afternoon on it. Information is only valuable if it gets somewhere. A person keeping records in a secure location is not the same thing as a record that reaches someone who can use it. Day 20. The sick woman. This is the part I've been putting off writing. Her name was Claire. She'd arrived at the elevator 3 days after us, alone, on a bicycle, with a rack full of loaded bags. She'd been a serious cyclist before everything, had the gear and the legs for it, and she'd biked from somewhere east of us over 2 days. She was in her late 30s, composure intact, no visible injuries when she arrived. She was fine for the first 4 days. She was useful. She had medical training, worked in a hospital, and she and Joe, the extension agent, formed an immediate partnership around the group's health logistics. She was calm and practical, and people liked her. On the 5th day, she said she had a headache and felt feverish. I was not the person who noticed the symptom first. Joe noticed. Joe came to me and Ford together, privately, and said that Claire had a fever of 101 and was complaining of neck stiffness and joint pain. We didn't say what we were thinking, not immediately. Ford said, "Where did she say she got the bite on her leg?" I hadn't heard about a bite on her leg. I looked at him. He said, "She mentioned it when she arrived. Said a dog bit her before she left. A neighbor's dog that had gotten loose. She said the dog wasn't infected." Joe said, "She said the dog wasn't infected." We all sat with that for a minute. The symptom progression we'd observed in people who were turning, from what we'd seen and from the radio accounts, was fever, disorientation, joint pain, and then a period of apparent unconsciousness before the rise. Not everyone progressed at the same rate, it seemed. The cases I'd watched from the catwalk had been relatively fast, 8 hours, but we'd heard accounts of longer timelines. Here is the hardest thing I've had to write in this notebook, and I'm going to write it plainly, because anything else would be a disservice to what actually happened. Ford and I and Joe and Danny made a decision together. We moved Claire to an isolated room, the far end of the processing shed, separated from the main group area. We told her we were doing this because we were worried about contagion. We told her this gently, and we told her it might be nothing, and we were just being cautious. She looked at us with the eyes of a person who has medical training and knows what it means when you get moved to isolation. She said, "I know." She didn't say anything else. We checked on her every 2 hours. Joe stayed close. I sat outside the room with the door between us, and we talked, she and I, for most of that night. She talked about her daughter, who had been in school in another state, about the hospital she'd worked in, and the people there, and what she'd seen in the first days. About a trip she'd taken to Portugal the previous spring, and the particular shade of blue of a certain bay. She said, "I know you're keeping watch." I said, "Yeah." She said, I'm not going to let it happen if I can help it. Okay? You don't have to." I said, "Okay." She said, "Tell my daughter. If you ever, tell her I wasn't afraid. Tell her I was practical about it. She'll understand that. Practical is what she'd want to hear." I said I would. I'm writing it down right now, because I'm going to keep my word. Her daughter's name is Ellie. She was a college junior in another state. Her mother was a practical woman who faced everything the way she faced it, directly, without drama, and with specific care for the people around her. Claire's fever broke before morning. Her symptoms reduced. She had some kind of flu or virus or stress response that was not, in fact, the thing we'd been afraid of. By morning, she was sitting up and asking for water, and Joe was trying not to show her relief too obviously, and I went outside the processing shed and sat on the concrete apron in the early morning and breathed for a while. Sometimes the thing you're afraid of is just the flu. Sometimes. Day 22. I'm going to write about the man who showed up at the south gate with a rifle. He'd been watching us for at least a day, we figured afterward. Amy had seen him on one of her runs, but not identified him as a threat at the time. Just someone in the distance on the road who seemed to know the road well. He came to the south gate at mid-morning, alone, with a deer rifle over his shoulder, in that specific carrying posture that means I am not pointing this at you, but I want you to see it. He was in his 40s, lean the way outdoor people get lean, a beard that had grown past any intentional stage. He said his name was Roy, and he wanted to talk to whoever was in charge. Ford went to the gate. I stood back and slightly to the side, where I could see the road behind Roy, in case he hadn't come alone. Roy said he had 11 people in a farmstead, about 3 miles east. He said they'd been there for 2 weeks. He said they had food problems. They'd started with more people, and they were down to 11, and the implication of that arithmetic was its own story. Ford said, "What do you want?" Roy said, "I want to know if you're real. I've been watching you for 2 days, and you look real. You've got a working operation." Ford said, "We're real." Roy said, "I want to bring my people here." Ford said, "We need to think about that." Roy said, "I've got something to trade. I've got a diesel fuel cache, 2,000 gallons in a farm tank, 3 miles east. It's mine, my family's farm. But if you take us in, the fuel comes with you. I'll show you where it is. 2,000 gallons of diesel. For a group running generators and vehicles, 2,000 gallons was a very significant thing to have." Roy looked at Ford and then at me. He said, "I'm not trying to push you. I'm just trying to keep 11 people alive." Ford looked at me. I looked at Ford. Ford said, "Come back tomorrow morning. We'll have an answer." Roy nodded once and walked back to the road. We talked it out for 4 hours that afternoon. The whole group. Ford did this. He ran group discussions, and I'd learned to respect it, even when I found it slower than I'd prefer. 22 people around the loading dock had an actual conversation about whether to take in 11 more. The arguments against more mouths, unknown people, Roy's rifle had made several people nervous. We didn't know why they were down from a higher number, and the reason mattered. The arguments for the fuel, genuinely, was not a small thing. And the moral one, which a woman named Patricia, who I hadn't talked to much, stated cleanly and plainly. There are 11 people trying to keep alive, and if we have the capacity, and we turn them away and they die, we've made a choice. Ford said, "We check every one of them the way we check everyone, thorough. And we talk to Roy before they come, alone, without the group, and I want to know what happened to the people who didn't make it." I said, "I'll talk to Roy." Roy came back the next morning, and we walked away from the gate together, the two of us, and I asked him directly. He told me, They'd started with 19 people. The first 3 they'd lost in the first week, before they'd figured out their location's vulnerabilities. One of those 3 had turned, and the resulting situation inside the farmhouse, before they got it under control, had cost them 2 more. After that, they'd been stable for a week. Then a man in the group, he said the man's name and I won't write it, had made a bad call, had gone outside at night, alone, for reasons that Roy said he still didn't fully understand, and had gotten bitten in the backyard, and had turned in the night, and had bitten 2 others before Roy had handled it in the dark with what he called the right tool. Roy said, the right tool without inflection, which told me he was a man who'd done a very hard thing in the dark, and was not going to elaborate on it, and I was not going to ask him to. He said 11 people remained, and they were all intact, and none of them were showing any symptoms. I said, the rifle. He said, I'm not going to bring it into your place if you don't want it. I understand why it makes people nervous. I said, keep it. It'll be useful. We walked back to the gate. I told Ford, bring them in, screen them, take the fuel. Day 25, 33 people, fuel to run the generator for months. Joe's food assessment said we were sustainable for 6 to 8 months on current stores with current population, if we began supplementing with foraging, and eventually with growing, which she was already planning. The land around the elevator was flat, and the soil in this county is good, and she had seeds that several of the new arrivals had brought with them. 6 to 8 months is a long time when you don't know what the world looks like outside the buffer zone. 6 to 8 months might be exactly enough time for something to shift. There was a night in the 3rd week when Danny and I sat on the elevator catwalk at about midnight, and I don't know who started it, but we ended up talking about our grandfather. Really talking. Not the practical talk of the previous weeks, but the other kind. The kind where you circle around the person who's gone and try to figure out what they were actually like, what they actually knew. Danny said, you think he knew it was going to be this specific thing? Zombies? I said, I think he knew something bad was coming from that direction. I don't think he knew it would be this. Danny said, then why the cellar? Why all of it? I said, because he was the kind of man who prepares for bad things without needing to know exactly which bad thing. Danny said he should have told us. I said, he tried. He left us everything we needed. He left us the letter and the room and the radio and Ford's frequency. He gave us a starting position. Danny said, he was 81, and he was alone in this, and he didn't want to sound like a crazy person. I said, yeah. We looked at the horizon. Stars. No glow from the southeast anymore. Whatever the military had done at the Haskell facility was done. Danny said, I keep thinking about Nora. I said, I know. He said, I don't know which is worse, not knowing or thinking about what knowing would be like. I didn't answer that, because there was no answer that helped. He said, if she turned, she'd still be somewhere. She'd be walking around somewhere. I said, Danny. He said, I know I can't. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, when this is over, when it's enough time and something changes, I'm going back to the city. I said, okay. He said, will you come? I said, yeah, I'll come. He nodded. We sat on the catwalk for another hour without saying anything else, and that was fine. Day 28. I need to write about the thing Amy found. She'd been ranging further on the bike runs, further than I was comfortable with, but she was careful, and she was fast, and she'd developed an instinct for the routes that was better than anyone else's, so I'd stopped arguing with her about range. She'd found a working gas station, shut but with fuel still in the underground tanks, about 4 miles northeast, and she'd helped coordinate a fuel run using Greg's work truck and a hand pump. She'd found an intact pharmacy about 3 miles east, with useful medical supplies that Joe had been excited about for 2 days. This thing was different. She said she'd biked down a service road that ran along the east edge of the Lassiter property toward the southeast, getting as close as she was comfortable to the area of the Haskell facility. Not to the facility, she said. She wasn't stupid, just close enough for a view. She said the facility complex was still standing. Whatever had burned on that night wasn't the buildings, or not all of them. She said there was smoke damage visible on one of the outbuildings, but the main cluster of low research buildings was intact. And she said there was a vehicle parked outside the facility's main entrance, a single vehicle, not military, just a truck, and someone was going in and out of the facility. I said, "Someone is in there." She said, "Going in and out." I watched for about 20 minutes. One person, I think, maybe two. I thought about the broadcast man, the signal that had cut out mid-sentence. I said, "You're sure the vehicle wasn't military?" She said, "It was a pickup truck with rust on the wheel wells. It was not military." Ford said no. He said it without hesitation when I brought it up. "No, we are not sending anyone to the Haskell facility. The risk is completely disproportionate, and whatever someone is doing there is their own business." I said, "The broadcast man said someone should preserve the evidence." Ford said, "We have Earl's drives." I said, "Earl's drives have 3 months of documentation that ends at his death. Whatever was happening at the facility in the weeks before the outbreak, whatever the actual mechanism was, that's in that building. Or it was, before the military sent someone in." Ford said, "Or it was destroyed in whatever they burned." I said, "Or it wasn't." We went around like this for a while. In the end, Ford said, "I'm not sending people. If you want to go, I won't stop you. But I'm not sending our resources or our people." I said, "Fair." I went and found Danny. 2 of us, on bikes, not trucks, because bikes are quieter and faster on these roads, and 2 people drawing less attention than a vehicle. In the early morning, first light, the way we'd been doing everything that needed careful timing. I want to write what we found, and I want to write it accurately, because I think this is the part that will matter most later, if this notebook ever matters to anyone. The facility on State Road 2 was a cluster of 6 low buildings, connected by covered walkways, the design that institutional construction from the 80s uses, functional and graceless, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had been topped with razor wire at some recent point. The razor wire was newer than the fence. You could see where it had been added, and the fence posts had additional anchor points that weren't original. Inside the fence, the landscaping was dead in the specific way that happens when institutional landscaping has been abandoned for months, not years. The grass long but not wild yet. The shrubs overgrown but still recognizable. The gate in the fence was open. The truck Amy had described was parked on the access road inside the fence. An old Ram, 2-tone, rust on the lower panels, empty. We leaned the bikes against the fence outside and went in through the gate on foot. I had the .38. Danny had the crowbar and a large hunting knife he'd gotten from Roy's group in a trade he was cagey about the terms of. The main building's front door was propped open with a brick. I'll say that again. Propped open with a brick. The way you prop a door open when you're making multiple trips and don't want the door to close. Deliberate, human, mundane, in a way that was at odds with everything else about the situation. We went in. The hallway was dim, lit by the morning light coming through the propped door and the exterior windows, which were large institutional affairs that the renovation hadn't replaced. The building smelled of antiseptic and something older underneath it, a laboratory smell compounded of chemicals I can't identify and probably shouldn't. The smell of a space where biological work has happened and doesn't fully leave. We followed the hallway. There were doors on both sides, most closed, some with small windows set into them at eye height. I didn't look through most of them. I looked through a few. Laboratory spaces. Empty now. Equipment still in place. The large equipment that wasn't worth moving. Incubators and hood units, and centrifuges. The benches were cleared. Documentation gone. Personal effects gone. The clearing out that happens when you know you're leaving, and you're taking the sensitive material with you. Professional cleaning out. But not complete. The third room we came to had a door that was ajar. Inside was what looked like a storage room, metal shelving, not laboratory benches. And on the shelves were boxes, sealed boxes of the kind laboratories use for sample archiving. And one box, on the bottom shelf, had its lid off, and next to it on the floor sat a man. He was maybe 60. Wire-rimmed glasses. A beard that had been neat at some earlier point in his life and wasn't anymore. Wearing a corduroy jacket over a flannel shirt that was wrong for August heat, but gave the impression of a person who always ran cold. He had a laptop open on his knees, and he was typing, and he did not immediately look up when we came in. He said, without looking up, "I heard you in the hallway. I'm not a threat. I'm just trying to finish this before the battery dies." I looked at Danny. Danny looked at me. I said, "Who are you?" He said, still typing, "My name is Walter Crane. I was a researcher here for 6 years. I was fired 8 months ago for objecting to the direction of a specific project. I've been trying to get back in since the outbreak started because I left documentation behind when they escorted me out of the building." He looked up. His eyes behind the glasses were the tired eyes of someone who has been working with high intensity for days without stopping. He said, "Are you the people from the grain elevator? Someone transmitted on that frequency a couple of weeks ago. I've been trying to raise you since." I said, "We're from the grain elevator." He said, "Good. I need your help carrying something." What Walter Crane told us. He told us for about an hour. He told us in the way a scientist tells a story, which is not chronological, but associative, jumping between findings, and then explaining the context that makes the finding matter. I'm going to try to summarize it as clearly as I can, because it needs to be clear. 6 years ago, the Haskell facility had been sold to a private company that held a federal research contract. The contract was for emergency preparedness, specifically for research into rapid immune response in livestock, which was the agricultural cover story and which was also partially real. They were genuinely doing agricultural pathogen research. What they were also doing, which Walter had discovered over his 4 years at the facility, before being given access to the sensitive project in year 5, was research on a pathogen modification that could survive in a host organism post-mortem. This was the phrase he used, survive in a host organism post-mortem. I said, "What does that mean in plain language?" He said, "It means they were developing a pathogen that continued to animate host motor functions after clinical death." The theory was emergency military application, a way to send compromised individuals back into a field situation when conventional medical response was not available. The research was dark, it was ethically insane, and I'm the person who said so formally in a report to the project director 8 months ago, and I was escorted out of the building with a signed NDA and a severance check. Danny said, "They were making the thing that's outside." Walter said, "They were trying to make a controlled version of it for military use. What they actually made got out of their containment protocols about 3 weeks before the first reported human cases. First animal cases were approximately 6 weeks before that. The early animal mortality on this property and adjacent properties," I said, "Amy saw dead animals along the county road." He said, "Yes, those would be the early overflow from the initial uncontrolled release. Animals are a less effective host for this pathogen. They don't typically reanimate with the same efficacy because of neurological differences, but they do transmit it to humans through bite, a dog bite, a rat bite, anything." I thought about Claire, the dog that bit her. Walter said, "The military's response was to establish a perimeter and to begin remediation protocols for the facility itself. They sent a team 10 days ago. The team burned the agricultural buildings and the animal housing and removed all the archival materials they could find from the main research building. What they didn't find was my personal research cache, which I had hidden in a location inside the building that I'd prepared 8 months ago, when I was removed, because I thought there was a possibility I'd need it later." He tapped the box on the bottom shelf. He said, "This is 3 years of my personal research notes, which are separate from the facility's official documentation. This includes my formal objection report, which names the project director and the contracting agency and the federal officer of record for the contract. It includes my documentation of the first animal mortality events and my analysis connecting those events to the containment failure." He said, "If this gets to a journalist or a federal whistleblower registry or a congressional oversight function, it will be the beginning of someone being held accountable for what happened in this county." I thought about Earl's drives. 3 months of documentation from a man outside the fence who'd noticed something wrong and couldn't stop watching. I said, "We have additional documentation." Walter looked at me. I told him about Earl. I told him about the drives, the photographs, the radio intercepts. Walter was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your grandfather. He was watching the facility." I said, "From a distance." "Yeah." Walter said, "That man. I don't know who he was, but whoever was watching from outside the fence, that external documentation, combined with the internal documentation I have, it's a complete picture. It's not just one person's account. It's corroborated from an independent source." He looked at us both. He said, "I need to get this out of Kessler County. I've been alone here for 10 days. I rode in on a bicycle, and my bicycle was lost to me on day 3, when I had to abandon it. I've been in this building since then." He said, "Can you help me?" We helped him. We cleared out what he needed: 2 boxes from the shelf, the laptop, a portable drive in his corduroy jacket pocket. Danny made 2 trips to the bikes and bungeed the boxes to the racks. I stayed with Walter, who moved carefully, like someone whose body had been still for too long and was complaining about being asked to move again. He had a gash on his shin from his bicycle crash that was healing wrong, red along the edges, and I made a mental note to get Joe to look at it. Before we left the building, I walked the hallway one more time. I'm not entirely sure why. A professional instinct, maybe, checking the space I was leaving, the same way I check a space I'm responsible for, looking for anything missed, looking for weak points. At the end of the hallway there was a fire door, and through the small window in the fire door, I could see the back area of the facility, a concrete apron behind the buildings, and beyond it, the agricultural outbuildings, and beyond those, the charred remains of whatever the military had burned. There were 3 of them in the back area, moving slowly across the concrete. Not inside the building. The building had been clear. Whatever the remediation team had done had included clearing the interior. But outside, on the property, 3 of them walking in their purposeless way, slightly toward nothing, the way they always were. I watched them for a second. I thought about Walter's words. Animate host motor. Functions after clinical death. These had been people. They had been people who lived in Kessler County, or who'd driven through it, or worked in it, and something that originated in the building I was standing in had gotten into them, and now they walked back and forth on a concrete apron until something stimulated them, or until they fell apart. Neither they nor the people who made what was in them had asked for any of this. The people who made it had asked for the money and the contract, which is not the same thing as asking for what it became. I left the building. I went out to the bikes. Walter was leaning against the fence with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been alone with a large thing for too long and has just shared it with another person, and the sharing has used the last of them. I said, "Let's go." We walked the bikes back toward the grain elevator. Walter between us. He was slowing us down, but not badly, and the roads were clear. We'd picked the route carefully, and Amy had run it 2 days before. About halfway back, Danny said, "How did you stay in that building for 10 days alone?" Walter said, "I had food. I had the work. When you have the work, the time is manageable." Danny said, "Were you scared?" Walter said, "I was scared when I was doing nothing. When I was working, I was fine. The moments between work and sleep were the worst." He adjusted the bag on his shoulder. "I'm 61 years old, and I've spent my career doing work that I thought mattered, and then I was escorted out of a building by a security guard because the thing I built mattered too much to the wrong people. It has a specific feeling, that. Being right in a way that makes everything worse." Danny didn't say anything. Walter said, "I'm sorry. That sounds self-pitying." Danny said, "It sounds honest." We walked the rest of the way without talking much. The morning light was fully up, and the fields around us were that particular August green that starts to go yellow at the tips, the late summer color, and the sky was clear blue, and the grain elevator was visible from a long way off, that concrete cylinder against the sky, solid and simple and real. Ford met us at the gate. He looked at Walter for a second and then at me. I said, This is Walter Crane. He was a researcher at the Haskell facility. He has documentation. Ford said, documentation of what? I said, everything. Ford looked at Walter. Walter looked at Ford. Ford said, I'll get you some breakfast. That was 4 days ago. I'm finishing this in the notebook, because the notebook is almost full. I've been writing for 30-something days, from the night I couldn't sleep in the farmhouse on that camping mattress, lying there listening to the strange highway noise, all the way to now. Here's where we are. 33 people at the grain elevator, plus Walter makes 34. Joe's sustainable food assessment is holding. The fuel from Roy's farm tank has been transferred, and we're set for months of generator operation. Ford has expanded the radio operation, and Helen has found 2 more active survivor groups in the county, 1 west of us and 1 north, and contact protocols have been established. The infection outside. We don't know the full scope. What Ford can see from the catwalk is the immediate area. Amy's runs give us a radius of 5 or 6 miles with good data. Beyond that is inference and radio reports. What we know, the county is infected, but not uniformly. The concentrations are heaviest along the old Route 9 corridor and in Hatterley Town. The outlying areas, farms, the elevator, have lower density. The infected don't cover ground quickly. They don't coordinate. They are a serious threat if you're careless or cornered, and they are manageable if you're careful and keep your distances. The military at the county perimeter. Still there by all accounts. We've heard their transmissions. Still using the word remediation. Still maintaining the hard perimeter that Walter has confirmed is protocol for an escaped modified pathogen. Still no entry into the county. We are still, for the purposes of official policy, a buffer zone. Walter's documentation and Earl's drives together. Helen has been helping Walter scan and catalog. We have 4 copies of the combined documentation now on separate drives. Walter is drafting a summary document, structured for presentation to a congressional or investigative audience, that Helen says reads clearly, even to a non-scientist. The question of what we do with that documentation, how we get it out of a quarantined county, in a world where normal communication and transportation have stopped, is one we haven't solved yet. We're working on it. Danny and I talked last night, on the catwalk again, which has become our place, the 2 of us, when we need to talk about the things that aren't logistics. He said, when you came back to help with the farmhouse, were you worried about me, before any of this? I said, what do you mean? He said, I mean, you came when I asked. It was a renovation, a week of work. You didn't have to come personally. You could have sent Teddy. I said, you're my brother. He said, I'm glad you came. I said, so am I. He looked at the horizon. He said, the farmhouse is still there, locked up. I said, yeah. He said, Earl's house. I said, still Earl's house. He thought about that. Then he said, when things change, when the perimeter comes down, or we find a way out, or someone comes through who can do something with Walter's documentation, I want to go back to the farmhouse first. Before the city. Before anything else. I said, why? He said, because I want to go back to the place where this started for us, where we built something. I want to see it still standing. I said, okay. He said, you think it'll still be standing? I said, I think we built it solid. I think Earl built it solid first, and we just added to what he made. That kind of thing stands. He nodded. The elevator was quiet around us. Below us, inside the loading dock, someone had a light on, orange, a candle or a lantern, through the gap in the dock door, and the sounds of 34 people sleeping, or talking low or doing whatever 34 people do when they're making the best of a concrete building in late summer. One more thing, and then this notebook is full. I picked a lock in a dead man's cellar and found a room he built for us. Not for anyone else. For us, specifically. For the locksmith and the carpenter. The 2 grandsons he'd raised by proxy after our dad left. The 2 people he trusted to be capable in the way he meant that word. I keep thinking about what he was like in the years he was watching the Haskell facility. sitting in the farmhouse alone with his radio and his suspicions, writing his careful notes and taking his long lens photographs. What it costs a man to know something and not know what to do with it. Earl was not a man who made dramatic gestures or emergency speeches. He was a man who found out where the bolts were weak and fixed them. He stocked the cellar and set up the radio, and found Ford Lassiter, and made sure that when his grandsons came to work on the house, whenever that was, whatever the context, they'd have a starting position. He left us a starting position. That's what I keep coming back to. When I look at the 34 people in this grain elevator, when I think about the documentation on those drives, when I think about the farmhouse 2 miles away standing locked and solid with the key under the flagstone, I think, someone gave us a starting position, and we didn't waste it. I think Earl would consider that sufficient. I think he'd call that capable. Danny just knocked on the door of the office I've been writing in. He said, "Ford wants everyone for a morning meeting. Helen found something on the radio overnight." I said, "Give me 2 minutes." He said, 2 minutes. He went back out. "I'm going to put this notebook with the drives, in the hard case, under the desk in Ford's office. That's where the things that matter live now. I'll start a new notebook when I have one. One thing I do know, this is not the end of the story. Whatever Helen found on the radio overnight, whatever Ford's morning meeting turns out to be, whatever happens with Walter's documentation, and the perimeter, and the infected on the county roads, and the question of Danny going to the city when the time comes, and whether Nora is there or not, none of it is the end. The end hasn't happened yet, and for as long as that's true, we have a starting position. And from a starting position you can do a lot. That's really all I know how to do. Find the lock, find the weak point, fix it, move to the next thing. It turns out that's enough. Earl knew it was enough. He was right. I'm going to go hear what Helen found.